Chapter 23. Riding on the dragon eagle, their traveling speed was much faster than before. In less than half a day, they had traveled thousands of miles. But Xiao Bailey did not stop and continued on his journey. He was going to return to the Hidden Sword sect soon after all, so he wanted to bring Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui to a safe place first. This was something that he could do. The two of them had to walk their own path in the future. They flew continuously for 7 days. They made a detour to the Gulan Forest on the other side of the southern Snow Kingdom. The Gulan Forest was the largest mountain range around the southern Snow Kingdom. There were countless demons, and it was a training ground for many cultivators. They landed in a valley that was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. The top was covered by leaves, so it was impossible to spy on this place from above. The valley entrance was very narrow, and it was shrouded in mist, so it was impossible to see the situation inside. There was a stone stele at the entrance, and there were 9 half-moon-shaped stones on it. Xiao Bailey led Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui over. In front of the stone stele, he reminded them, "I have placed a restrictive spell on this valley. If you enter without permission, you will be attacked by the miasma, and your whole body will be paralyzed. Those with weaker cultivation will die on the spot. You must remember the sequence of activating the spell." Zhou Xuanji nodded and said, "Let's begin. I have a photographic memory." Xiao Bailey immediately moved the 9 mechanism stones, but in different directions and at different angles. He paused for every stone he moved, so that Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui could remember it. After the spell formation was activated, the miasma at the valley entrance dissipated at a speed visible to the naked eye. Zhou Xuanji immediately went up and tried a few times. He saw the miasma recede and rise again, then recede again. He suddenly thought of a problem, a very serious problem. Will the miasma run out? Xiao Bailey rubbed his head and replied with a smile, "Don't worry. The miasma comes from within the mountain. I have planted a few types of rare herbs that can last for 100 years. With your temperament, you will probably leave in less than 20 years." Zhou Xuanji heard him and was immediately relieved. He activated the mechanism again and walked in with little Jiang Shui. After going around the small path, they saw the mechanism again. According to his calculations, the mechanism path was 30 meters long, and there were many demon corpses along the way. There was a pavilion in the valley, and in front of the pavilion was a pond. The pond was so clear that the bottom could be seen, and there were many small fish swimming in it. The walls of the mountain were covered with moss and all kinds of plants, giving off the feeling of a paradise. "Wow!" Little Jiang Shui cried out in surprise and immediately pulled Zhou Xuanji over. Ada and little Air also began to chase and play. Xiao Bailey stroked his beard and laughed complacently. "Back then, I spent a month cleaning up this place." However, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui did not listen to him. They were already wandering around. Out of desperation, he began to inspect the valley in case any powerful demonic beasts or poisonous insects were hiding. Fortunately, there were no hidden dangers in the valley. At this point, they finally stopped rushing around. At night, one could see the moon and stars through the gaps between the leaves at the top of the valley. Even without an oil lamp, the moonlight shone into the valley. Zhou Xuanji made a swing. He and little Jiang Shui sat on it, swaying as they looked at the night sky. "This place is pretty good. I hope we don't have to run away anymore." Little Jiang Shui hugged Zhou Xuanji and giggled. Zhou Xuanji felt very uncomfortable. He felt that his body was stuck, but little Jiang Shui did not want to let go, so he could not use force. With his strength, how could little Jiang Shui withstand it? This girl was too clingy. She was treating him like a toy. Zhou Xuanji twisted his upper body into a more comfortable position and said, "When I grow up, I will bring you to a human city. We will live in a big house." Now that he was already a foundation-building cultivator, he could live comfortably in any empire. However, he had to wait a few more years, until the Empress thought that he was dead before he could leave. Only 4 years had passed, which was nothing to the great Zhou Empire. Actually, it's not bad here. Little Jiang Shui pouted and said softly. Ever since she met Shenhua and the Yellow Gust 17 fiends, she felt that humans were more terrifying than demons. Zhou Xuanji comforted her, don't worry. Even if we go back, no one will dare to bully us. Far away, beside the pool, Qiu Bailey, who was cultivating on a tree, frowned slightly. He sensed a tinge of murderous intent from Zhou Xuanji's tone. Who does this brat want to kill? He had the intention to take revenge at such a young age. He did not know if it was a blessing or a curse. Qiu Bailey was a little worried. He even had a premonition that the world would change because of Zhou Xuanji. In the next 2 months, Zhou Xuanji would bring little Jiang Shui out for adventures every day, so that she could practice fighting. At night, Qiu Bailey would teach little Jiang Shui some basic spells, such as the fireball spell, water repelling spell, and wind summoning spell. In the blink of an eye, little Jiang Shui broke through to the 5th level of qi nurturing. Zhou Xuanji's cultivation did not break through, but his strength increased significantly. According to Qiu Bailey's estimation, this little monster's physical strength had already reached 17,000 pounds. If he used the golden body incantation, his strength would increase even more. This day, Qiu Bailey prepared to leave. At the entrance of the valley, Zhou Xuanji asked, "Why are you leaving early?" Qiu Bailey smiled as he stroked his long beard. He was dressed in a white robe, and he looked like an enlightened cultivator from the mountains. He said with a smile, "If I don't leave, how can you focus on your cultivation?" Zhou Xuanji grinned and did not reply. With Qiu Bailey around, he could not take out all his legendary swords. One must have a trump card. I have said what I need to say, so I will not nag anymore. Just one thing. Qiu Bailey rubbed little Jiang Shui's head with a kind face. He turned to look at Zhou Xuanji and said, "Keep your guard up." After that, he turned around and left. A flying sword flew out from his sleeves and circled around his body. It flew to his front, and he leaped onto the sword easily. "Zhou Xuanji, I hope that the next time we meet, your name will have spread across the world. Don't tell anyone about our friendship." Swoosh, Qiu Bailey left on his sword and disappeared into the depths of the forest. Little Jiang Shui's eyes turned red as she watched, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Zhou Xuanji also felt his eyes itch. This old guy is really something. He understood the meaning of Qiu Bailey's last sentence. It was not that he despised Zhou Xuanji. He was worried that he would be a burden to Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji had no parents and only little Jiang Shui. Qiu Bailey knew that he would have an extraordinary future, so he did not want to become Zhou Xuanji's weakness. Zhou Xuanji heaved a long sigh and activated the mechanism. The miasma rose again. Whoosh, not far away, a big flapped its wings and cried. Small air followed behind it. Zhou Xuanji nudged little Jiang Shui with his shoulder and said with a smile, "Sister, let's go. I want to eat roasted rabbit tonight." Little Jiang Shui's tears turned into a smile. She rolled her eyes at Zhou Xuanji and said, "Rabbits are so cute. They won't taste good roasted. Let's boil them into soup." "No way, listen to me." Zhou Xuanji grinned and said. He waved his right hand, and the frost wave sword appeared in front of him. He leaped up and landed on the frost wave sword, then stretched out his hand toward little Jiang Shui. Little Jiang Shui pouted and looked reluctant, but she still stretched out her right hand. Chapter 24. After Qiu Bailey's departure, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui did not feel any discomfort in their lives. Zhou Xuanji began training with the Crimson Dragon Sword, Frost Wave Sword, Bloodbath Sword, Tiger Roar Sword, Wind Cutter Sword, and Swine Culling Sword. He wanted to control 6 swords at the same time. Not only that, but he also had to practice the Golden Body incantation and internalize qi. He had a full schedule every day, so he wasn't bored at all. Little Jiang Shui was very talented in the spring snow technique. She could conjure all kinds of spells with ease. They were extremely gorgeous, and sometimes, Zhou Xuanji was envious. The two dragon eagles did not slack off either. Zhou Xuanji also formulated a cultivation plan for them. For demonic beasts, a strong physique was the most important. Zhou Xuanji recalled the miserable scene of the adult dragon eagle being surrounded and attacked, so he arranged for them to crash into the mountain every day. Honing his defense. Why not hit the tree? Because they were almost 2 meters tall and had a wingspan of 6 meters, most of the trees in the forest could not withstand their impact. Time passed. Half a year had passed. Zhou Xuanji reached foundation building level 2. Analyzed that the sword owner has reached 7 years old. Gotcha started. Ding. Congratulations, the sword owner has obtained silver, golden rock sword and 10,000 level 3 spirit stones. 10,000 grade 3 spirit stones. F***CK. Getting rich overnight? Zhou Xuanji shuddered and jumped up from the grass. At this moment, he was lying on the waist of a mountain. Below him was an undulating mountain range, with forests on both sides and mountains in the distance. The scenery was pleasant. Little Jiang Shui, Ada, and Small Air were hunting rabbits. 10,000 grade 3 spirit stones was a lot. In addition to Madame Knight Seven's wealth, Zhou Xuanji was already a tycoon. Even if he used spirit stones to cultivate every day, it would be enough for him to squander for decades. Zhou Xuanji felt quite pleased and immediately took out the golden rock sword. At the same time, 3 lines of small words appeared before his eyes: sword name, golden rock sword, level, silver, description, made from golden rock, it is extremely hard. When struck by a sword, it will have a certain petrifying effect. This effect does not target the sword master. Petrification? It sounded very powerful. He wielded the golden rock sword and chopped at the grass on the ground. The blade of the sword sliced through several grass shavings, which then turned into golden stones. At first glance, they looked like gold. Miraculous. Zhou Xuanji did not leave but waited. He wanted to see how long the petrification effect would last. The petrification effect lasts for about half an hour. The sword spirit's voice came suddenly, as though he could not bear to keep Zhou Xuanji waiting. Zhou Xuanji looked delighted. The golden rock sword might be able to save his life in this life or death crisis. He immediately used the golden rock sword to execute the white crane sword technique. His body was like a crane, agile and graceful. He was like a banished immortal halfway up the mountain, and the sound of his sword cutting through the air was incessant. After practicing the white crane sword technique 10 times, he got used to the golden rock sword. Compared to other divine swords, the golden rock sword was heavier. Fortunately, he was strong enough to easily swing it. Zhou Xuanji stopped and was about to sheath his sword. "Hey, little wimp, what sword technique are you practicing?" An arrogant voice came, and Zhou Xuanji turned around in shock. He saw a man in black standing at the edge of the forest at the foot of the mountain. His face was handsome, and his black hair was long and straight, casually draped over his shoulders. At his waist was a long sword inlaid with jewels, and his hands hung naturally by his side. Just by standing still, he exuded a faint pressure. Zhou Xuanji's expression changed slightly and asked, "How long have you been watching?" The man in black snorted coldly, "Not long. I saw you practice it 3 times. His tone was slightly mocking, and Zhou Xuanji could hear the mockery in it. What he meant was, "Brat, I saw you practice it 3 times, and you did not even realize it." Zhou Xuanji was not angry but heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the man did not notice his embarrassing behavior. "Hey, I'm asking you. What sword technique is that?" The man in black spoke again. He frowned and looked displeased. Zhou Xuanji sensed that his opponent was not simple, but he cultivated the qi-obscuring incantation. He was used to hiding his aura and did not expose his cultivation, so he might be able to confuse his opponent. White Crane Sword Technique. Zhou Xuanji replied. He did not steal it anyway. He did not believe that anyone else had the supreme legendary sword system. Oh, spar with me? I won't use sword chi or draw my sword. I'll use the scabbard. The man in black walked up the mountain. Zhou Xuanji opened his eyes wide at his words. Zhou Xuanji said furiously, I'm only 7 years old. You want to bully a child? The man in black did not seem to be an evil person, or else he would have attacked long ago. He was probably excited by the prospect. The man in black curled his lip and said, Do you know who I am? My name is Xiao Jinghong. You can ask around, and you will know how powerful I am. I've been honest all my life and will never harm you. As long as you spar with me, I will teach you a sword technique. With your talent, if you can master it, you will have a chance to enter Great Zhou's hero ranking board. Zhou Xuanji was stunned. Such arrogance. He knew about Great Zhou's hero ranking board. Even Yi Fifan, who was at the inner pellet stage, was only ranked 92nd. Which meant that Xiao Jinghong was sure that he could reach the enlightening stage or even higher. That's right. A 7-year-old child who could master a sword technique was naturally a genius. Zhou Xuanji raised his brow and asked, What if I defeat you? Will you attack me out of anger? Xiao Jinghong shook his head as he walked. I will not lose. He had never lost to a sword cultivator in the same stage as him. Moreover, his opponent was only a 7-year-old child. He was a sword maniac and was interested in any sword technique that he did not understand. He had even asked a mortal elder to spar with him. What if I really lose? Zhou Xuanji asked condescendingly. He looked so serious that Xiao Jinghong wanted to laugh. The ignorant were fearless indeed. If you can defeat me, I will take you as my teacher. How about that? Xiao Jinghong walked up to him and said as he looked down at him. Zhou Xuanji was only 7 years old, and his height only reached his waist. Having heard him, Zhou Xuanji put away his golden rock sword and took out his wind-cutter sword. He had a storage bag at his waist, which could confuse his opponent. The wind-cutter sword was 1 level lower than the golden rock sword, but it looked extraordinary as well. Zhou Xuanji did not want to expose the petrifying ability of the golden rock sword, in case Xiao Jinghong became greedy. Take a weaker sword? Xiao Jinghong shook his head and laughed. This kid had the character of a sword cultivator. He used the scabbard, and Zhou Xuanji used a sword of a lower grade. This kid has a bright future. The two of them were less than a meter apart. At this distance, Xiao Jinghong had a million ways to kill him. You first. Xiao Jinghong did not waste time and instructed him directly. Zhou Xuanji sighed. Of all the things, you had to compete in sword techniques. Aren't you looking for trouble? Xiao Jinghong thought that he was afraid, so he comforted him, Don't worry. I will not use more strength than you. Say no more. Watch my sword. Zhou Xuanji raised his sword and pierced toward Xiao Jinghong's jaw. The wind-cutter sword, which had no wind resistance, was extremely fast. Xiao Jinghong's pupils contracted. Oh no. Such a fast sword. Chapter 25. Xiao Jinghong was still Xiao Jinghong after all. Even though he was so close to Zhou Xuanji, he still reacted quickly by leaning his body and head back. Whoosh, the wind-cutter sword sliced off a strand of Xiao Jinghong's black hair. Xiao Jinghong raised his right knee instinctively and wanted to send Zhou Xuanji flying. Zhou Xuanji reacted quickly as well. He pulled down with his right hand and used the bottom of the wind-cutter sword's hilt to hit his right knee. Bang! Both of them took 2 steps back. Xiao Jinghong did not lie. He did not use more strength than Zhou Xuanji. This strength is not right. Is he really only 7 years old? Xiao Jinghong thought to himself in shock. He couldn't help but think of a freak from the great Zhou Empire who had immense strength since he was young. But that guy was gigantic and did not look like a human, while Zhou Xuanji looked no different from an ordinary child. Before he could think further, Zhou Xuanji attacked again. Zhou Xuanji was already a foundation-building cultivator and had already developed sword qi. But since Xiao Jinghong did not use sword qi or spirit energy, he would not use either. Let's use pure swordsmanship to determine who's better. Thud. Zhou Xuanji stomped on the ground with his right foot. His body spun as he thrust his sword with his right hand. Tilting his body, the wind cutter sword could only reach Xiao Jinghong's chest. Clang! 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 Xiao Jinghong placed his left hand behind his back and held his scabbard with his right hand. His hands were so fast that they left afterimages as he blocked each of Zhou Xuanji's slashes. Zhou Xuanji was not discouraged, and the speed of his sword continued to increase. What a fast sword! I was only able to achieve such a speed when I was 16. Xiao Jinghong was secretly shocked. He didn't expect to meet such a rare genius. His competitive heart was stimulated. He suddenly clasped the scabbard and took the opportunity to stop the wind cutter sword. Next, he stepped out with his right foot and pushed forward with his right arm. With his height advantage, he pressed Zhou Xuanji backward. In the blink of an eye, Zhou Xuanji stretched his waist and somersaulted backward, distancing himself from Xiao Jinghong. Xiao Jinghong's eyes focused. He moved his sword quickly with his right hand, and the sword flashed like dozens of sharp swords piercing toward Zhou Xuanji. The wind howled, and the sword flashed on Zhou Xuanji's face. He did not panic at all. His eyes were bright, and his expression was calm. The moment he landed, Xiao Jinghong's sword was less than 20 centimeters away from his face. When their eyes met, Xiao Jinghong's expression changed slightly. This kid's expression reminded him of that kendo grandmaster. At this moment, Zhou Xuanji disappeared suddenly. Xiao Jinghong subconsciously tilted his head, but his cheek was still pierced, and a trace of blood flowed out of the wound. He turned around and saw Zhou Xuanji 10 meters away. What sword move is this? Xiao Jinghong asked with a burning gaze. He wasn't angry, but rather excited. Zhou Xuanji's back was facing him. He tilted his head slightly and glanced at him with the corner of his eye. White Crane Sword Technique, White Crane Celestial Trace, the third form. Great sword technique. Xiao Jinghong sighed in amazement. After that, his gaze changed and became incredibly sharp. He came up to Zhou Xuanji with one step and slashed with his sword. This step contained the profoundness of shrinking the ground into inches, and Zhou Xuanji's eyes could not follow it at all. He instinctively blocked with his sword. Bang! Xiao Jinghong's scabbard pierced Zhou Xuanji's chest and sent him flying. Zhou Xuanji flew halfway up the mountain and was about to hit the ground. Zhou Xuanji somersaulted, and his sword pierced into the ground as he slid down the mountain. Damn it! It hurts! Zhou Xuanji cursed in his heart and immediately entered the White Crane Swordwell mode. Xiao Jinghong looked down at him from high above and said, "Brat, you are still too weak." Just when he finished speaking, Zhou Xuanji was already in front of him. The wind cutter sword was as fast as lightning. The wind howled, and the sword shone brightly. Xiao Jinghong blocked with his scabbard and retreated continuously. This is sword will. Xiao Jinghong was shocked. A 7-year-old child mastered the sword will? Far away, little Jiang Shui, who was hunting rabbits, noticed Zhou Xuanji's movement. She turned around and could only see the flash of a sword. What's going on? Little Jiang Shui immediately rode on small air and flew toward Zhou Xuanji. With the White Crane Sword will, Zhou Xuanji had already become one with his sword. But in his eyes, Xiao Jinghong still had no flaws. One must know that when he sparred with Qiu Bailey, he could still see Qiu Bailey's flaws, even though they were few. This guy was even more powerful than Qiu Bailey. Soon, Xiao Jinghong was forced to the top of the mountain by Zhou Xuanji. If he continued to retreat, he would fall. Since he could not use his spirit energy and sword qi, Xiao Jinghong could not fly. He stepped back with his left foot and flipped the scabbard with his right hand. His movement stirred up air currents and disrupted Zhou Xuanji's sword momentum. He pulled back and tried to pull Zhou Xuanji down the cliff. The cliff was only 10 meters tall. He believed that Zhou Xuanji would not fall to his death. No matter who he sparred with, his desire for victory was the same. I can't lose. Seeing that he was about to fall, Zhou Xuanji stepped on Xiao Jinghong's boots, and both of them fell down the cliff. Clang! 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 Even though they were falling through the air, the two did not stop their movements. With the white crane's sword will, Zhou Xuanji had the upper hand. The moment he landed, Xiao Jinghong turned around. His aura changed suddenly. I'll show you my sword will. Xiao Jinghong laughed coldly. He turned into a beam of white light and charged toward Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji was like a white crane. His legs turned into wings, and he slashed with his sword. The blade and scabbard clashed, producing an ear-piercing sound. Zhou Xuanji was sent flying backward. Xiao Jinghong followed up with another attack. The speed at which he swung his right arm was more than twice as fast as before. In the air, little Jiang Shui looked down worriedly. But she did not dare to make a sound, for fear that she would disturb Zhou Xuanji. She was already 11 years old and had cultivated for a few years. She could tell that Xiao Jinghong and Zhou Xuanji were not fighting to the death. The battle between the two was like the spar between Zhou Xuanji and Qiu Beili. But she did not know Xiao Jinghong, so she could not help but worry. Xiao Jinghong kicked swiftly with his legs and swung his scabbard wildly, forcing Zhou Xuanji to step back. The two moved faster than an ordinary person, and they kicked up 2 rows of dust. You are indeed a genius in the way of the sword. You can even say that you are the most talented person I have ever seen. But it's a pity that you are still not my opponent. Remember my name, Sword Noble Xiao Jinghong. Xiao Jinghong said with a faint smile. He looked relaxed, as though he was not fighting. Sword Noble. Zhou Xuanji's pupils contracted. Little Jiang Shui, who was in the air, could not help but cover her mouth. They had heard of this name from Qiu Beili. Ranked 3rd on Great Zhou's hero ranking board. He broke through to inner pellet at the age of 30. His talent in the way of the sword was unparalleled. It was said that even the sword monarch of Great Zhou wanted to take him as his disciple. No wonder he was so powerful. Zhou Xuanji was not discouraged. Instead, he was full of fighting spirit. He raised his left hand, and the tiger roar sword appeared in his hand. He held the sword with both hands. Xiao Jinghong opened his eyes wide. This guy knows how to use a sword with his left hand? Roar! A tiger's roar shook the forest. The tiger roar sword was enveloped in flames and transformed into a flaming sword. Fiery sword technique. Zhou Xuanji slashed with his left hand furiously. The scorching flames made Xiao Jinghong retreat instinctively. Chapter 26. How can there be someone in this world who can use 2 sword intents at the same time? Impossible. Even the sword monarch of Great Zhou couldn't do it. Xiao Jinghong was shocked. He looked at Zhou Xuanji as though he was looking at a monster. Mastering 2 sword wills at the age of 7 was already shocking enough. But this 7-year-old child was actually able to use 2 sword intents at the same time. Defying the heavens. It was illogical. The heavenly Tao was unfair. Xiao Jinghong could no longer remain calm. Due to his shock, his right hand was in disarray, causing him to lose his rhythm from the tiger roar sword and wind cutter sword. Xiao! The sound of the blade slicing through the air stopped abruptly. Zhou Xuanji stopped. Xiao Jinghong also stopped. His eyes were wide open, and his face was covered in cold sweat. The tiger roar sword pierced into the ground. Zhou Xuanji stepped on the hilt with his left foot and leaned forward. He held the wind cutter sword in his right hand and stabbed forward. The tip of the sword was less than 2 centimeters away from Xiao Jinghong's throat. The white crane stood firm. The outcome had been decided. You lost, Zhou Xuanji said calmly. In terms of pure sword techniques, Zhou Xuanji defeated Xiao Jinghong unexpectedly with 2 sword wills. He was not pleasantly surprised but only relieved. If they were to fight to the death, Xiao Jinghong would be able to kill him with a single strike. At the same time, he admired Xiao Jinghong. This guy kept his word. If Zhou Xuanji did not stop just now, Xiao Jinghong's throat would have been slit. Even in such a situation, Xiao Jinghong did not break the promise, which showed how strong his mental fortitude was. Perhaps with Xiao Jinghong's cultivation, cutting his throat might not be fatal. Zhou Xuanji thought as he sheathed his sword. He landed on the ground and pulled out the tiger roar sword. Little Jiang Shui jumped down from small air's back and ran to Zhou Xuanji. She grabbed his shoulder and asked anxiously, Xuanji, are you hurt? Zhou Xuanji shook his head and smiled, no, don't worry. Xiao Jinghong ignored them and stood rooted to the ground, muttering, I actually lost. It was not that he had never lost, but he had lost to a 7-year-old child. At this moment, he was not ashamed. He was recalling the scene just now. 2 sword intense, how did he do it? He also knew how to wield 2 swords, but he couldn't use 2 different sword wills at the same time. He looked up at Zhou Xuanji with a complicated expression. This expression frightened Zhou Xuanji. He immediately waved his hand and said, I'm a magnanimous person. I won't force you to take me as your teacher. For a world-famous expert like Sword Monarch, his face was definitely more important than his life. If he were to acknowledge a 7-year-old child as his master, wouldn't he become a laughing stock if word got out? Xiao Jinghong did not heave a sigh of relief. Instead, he stared at Zhou Xuanji with a burning gaze, which made Zhou Xuanji's anus tighten. Little Jiang Shui quickly pulled Zhou Xuanji and ran toward the waiter. At this moment, Xiao Jinghong suddenly shouted, Master. Zhou Xuanji staggered and almost fell flat on his face. He stopped and looked at Xiao Jinghong with a strange expression, Are you sure? I'm only 7 years old. If word of this gets out, it'll damage your reputation. Don't worry, I'll pretend nothing happened today. Xiao Jinghong shook his head, looked at him from afar, and said, I'll take you as my teacher. Teach me how to use 2 sword intense at the same time. He was a sword maniac. How could he let someone like Zhou Xuanji go? If he could master the dual sword wills, he would definitely be able to dominate the world. He might even be able to challenge for the position of Sword Monarch of Great Zhou in the future. Thinking of this, his gaze became even more fiery. Zhou Xuanji frowned and fell into deep thought. Xiao Jinghong's character was not bad, and he was so powerful. If he could take him as his disciple, his reputation as a future sword god would not be tarnished. Xuanji, be careful. Humans are vicious. Little Jiang Shui reminded him softly. Ever since she met the Yellow Gust 17 fiends, she was even more cautious than Zhou Xuanji when she met strangers. Having heard that, Xiao Jinghong said loudly, Master, I can teach you my sword technique. In the future, when the dual sword wills awe the world, I will not forget you. You will always be the creator of the dual sword wills. For sword cultivators, they could not allow others to take the name of their own sword technique. Xiao Jinghong had obtained sword techniques from dozens of swordsmen, but he had never taken their names. Zhou Xuanji let go of little Jiang Shui's hand and walked toward Xiao Jinghong. He stopped 3 meters away from Xiao Jinghong and said, Why are you so hasty in taking me as your teacher? Xiao Jinghong was stunned and did not understand. Can't I take you as my teacher? Zhou Xuanji said seriously. Since he was going to take Zhou Xuanji as his teacher, he could not just say it. In the future, he would surely surpass Xiao Jinghong, so it was Xiao Jinghong's fortune to have him as his teacher. Xiao Jinghong's expression changed slightly. Although he was going to become the disciple of a 7-year-old child, wasn't it a little too much to go through the formalities of becoming the disciple? He was the Sword King. Ranked third on the hero ranking board of Great Zhou. Zhou Xuanji did not speak anymore. If he did not bow, then he could not take him as his teacher. He believed that with Xiao Jinghong's character, he wouldn't kill him because of this. Otherwise, he would have made his move long ago. One must know that even Xiao Bailey praised the Sword King for being open and honest. Xiao Jinghong took a deep breath and knelt down on one knee. He cupped his fists and said, "Disciple Xiao Jinghong greets master." In order to learn the dual sword wills, he endured. Little Jiang Shui's eyes widened in disbelief. The dignified sword monarch actually knelt before Xianji? Zhou Xuanji smiled and raised his right hand. The Frost Wave sword, the Golden Rock sword, the Wind Cutter sword, and the Tiger Roar sword appeared above his head, floating motionlessly. Xiao Jinghong was stunned by this scene. Zhou Xuanji waved his right hand, and the four legendary swords swept past Xiao Jinghong's head with extreme speed. Xiao! 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 Boom! The four swords pierced through the hillside and swept up countless pebbles. They flew up from the back of the hillside and split into four trajectories. They circled in the air like rainbows, as though they were alive. Xiao Jinghong opened his eyes wide and looked back at Zhou Xuanji, asking, "Controlling the swords with your heart?" He could do it too, but all the swords could only fly in one direction. He could not control them as freely as Zhou Xuanji could. Legend had it that the sword monarch of Great Zhou could control 7 swords at will and created his own sword's way. He did not expect Zhou Xuanji to do it too, although it was only 4 swords. Zhou Xuanji pretended to be cool and said, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, I can teach you." Xiao Jinghong was convinced. He would never forget this scene for the rest of his life. For many years to come, he would sigh at his madness. He had a 7-year-old as his teacher, and the most important thing was that he made the right choice. And now, Zhou Xuanji had his first disciple. And it was the sword noble whose name shook Great Zhou. In order to convince Xiao Jinghong, Zhou Xuanji felt that he had to do something more. After sheathing his sword, he raised his brow and said, "Other than the sword techniques that you don't impart to others, teach me the sword techniques that you think are the most difficult. I can achieve the sword will in 2 days." Xiao Jinghong got up and said with a frown, "Little master, you can't joke around." His sword techniques were all top-notch, but the number of times he was able to cultivate the sword will could be counted on one hand, and all of them took several years. 2 days. Impossible. Zhou Xuanji smiled and said, "Since you are my disciple, I must show you something to comfort you. The more powerful I am, the less uncomfortable you will feel, right?" Chapter 27. If I can't do it, I'll teach you dual sword wills. I don't need you to take me as your master. How about it? Zhou Xuanji snorted. This disciple of his did not trust him, so he had to teach him a lesson. Xiao Jinghong's eyes lit up, and he immediately nodded. Without another word, he drew his sword and began to display his swordsmanship. Zhou Xuanji's mouth twitched. This guy was not sincere in taking him as his teacher. He didn't think too much about it and focused all his attention on Xiao Jinghong. Little Jiang Shui walked over with little air. Ada also descended from the sky. The two of them stared at Xiao Jinghong speechlessly. It had to be said that the sword monarch was indeed the sword monarch. His sword technique was executed in an unrestrained and swift manner, giving others a shock to their souls. Unstoppable. Even though Xiao Jinghong's sword was not fast, Zhou Xuanji had such a thought. There were a total of 49 moves in this sword technique. Each move was closely linked, and the attacks were continuous. It could attack any part of the enemy without any flaws. To prevent Zhou Xuanji from remembering it, Xiao Jinghong practiced it twice. Both times were not fast, but it was enough for Zhou Xuanji to remember. Just when Xiao Jinghong was about to practice it again to strengthen his memory, Zhou Xuanji flipped his right hand and took out the swine-culling sword. Practicing swordsmanship with the swine-culling sword was quite impressive. Zhou Xuanji, who was 7 years old, was already at foundation building level 2. Naturally, it was not as difficult for him to train his sword as before. Xiao Jinghong was stunned and slowly sheathed his sword. That's right. Those who can practice dual sword arts are naturally very talented and have a photographic memory. Xiao Jinghong shook his head and chuckled. This kid could not be measured by the standards of a 7-year-old child. The first time, Zhou Xuanji swung his sword even slower than Xiao Jinghong. Xiao Jinghong didn't make fun of him. Instead, he introduced it to him. This is the Trisource Vein Severing Sword. When mastered, it can sever all the meridians of the enemy in an instant. After the first round, Zhou Xuanji began the second round, which was even faster than the first. Xiao Jinghong looked at little Jiang Shui and asked, "Which clan are you from?" With Zhou Xuanji's talent, his background must be extraordinary. Little Jiang Shui curled her lips and said, "I can't say." This was what Zhou Xuanji had taught her. To remain mysterious and instill fear in others. Xiao Jinghong shook his head and laughed. He turned his gaze back to Zhou Xuanji. Although Zhou Xuanji's training was decent, it was still wishful thinking for him to form a sword will. Sword intent was not something that could be cultivated. It needed to be comprehended. The third time. The fourth time. The fifth time. Zhou Xuanji swung his sword faster and faster. Within the time it took for an incense stick to burn, he had practiced 10 times. Xiao Jinghong's expression became even more solemn. Why did he feel that Zhou Xuanji was about to master the Trisource Vein Severing Sword? The 15th time. The 20th time. The 30th time. The 40th time. The 50th time. Trisource Vein Severing Sword Technique, Minor Mastery. Xiao Jinghong's eyes widened in disbelief. Little Jiang Shui, on the other hand, was used to it. She laid on small airs back and yawned. Zhou Xuanji's sword speed increased abruptly, and he finished practicing once in 10 breaths time. The Trisource Vein Severing Sword was all about speed and accuracy. It could destroy all of the enemy's meridians at an extremely fast speed. If it was controlled by sword chi, it could split mountains and rivers. After 100 times, Zhou Xuanji's Trisource Vein Severing Sword reached great accomplishment. Xiao Jinghong was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. Just who was this kid? Could he be the reincarnation of an ancient sword emperor? Or could it be that he already knew the Trisource Vein Severing Sword? Zhou Xuanji continued to practice and finished 49 moves in 10 breaths. The more he practiced, the less time he spent on them. For the 120th time, he only spent 7 breaths time. The sword's momentum was swift and fierce. It swept up waves of strong winds and flattened the ground, forcing a big and small air to back off. For the 150th time, he only spent 3 breaths time. For the 199th time, Zhou Xuanji only spent 1 breath's time. For the 200th time, his aura suddenly changed. He closed his eyes and mastered the 49 moves in the blink of an eye. Sword Will. Trisource Vein Severing Sword Will. Zhou Xuanji held his sword in his right hand, and the swine-culling sword turned into a stream of black light. Countless sword shadows appeared, and 3 streaks of sword chi shot out in the shape of claws. They only dissipated after flying for 100 meters. Little Jiang Shui opened her eyes wide. So handsome. Xiao Jinghong was in a state of confusion. He really mastered the sword will, and it was not just 2 days. How long has it been? 4 hours? The sun had not even set. Zhou Xuanji stored his sword and walked up to Xiao Jinghong. How is it? His face was calm, but he was delighted in his heart. Such a domineering sword technique. It was even more powerful than the white crane sword technique and the fiery sword technique. Just this sword technique alone was enough to double his battle power. Xiao Jinghong took a deep breath and cupped his fist. Revered teacher, you are awesome. His attitude changed from teacher to revered teacher. He was really impressed. After living for decades, it was his first time meeting someone who was more talented than him in the way of the sword. And it was not just by a little bit. At this moment, Xiao Jinghong could no longer treat Zhou Xuanji as a 7-year-old kid. This kid was definitely the reincarnation of an ancient powerhouse. Xiao Jinghong had heard many legends and knew that many powerhouses would leave behind a part of their soul for reincarnation before they died. Zhou Xuanji must be one of them. In his previous life, this kid must have been a powerhouse in the way of the sword. Zhou Xuanji turned his head and saw that it was already dusk. "See you here tomorrow at noon," he said. After that, he turned and walked toward Big. Xiao Jinghong did not ask him to stay. He trusted Zhou Xuanji. He was confident in his judgment. Although Zhou Xuanji was young, he could do what he said. He sat on the ground and began to cultivate. Zhou Xuanji flipped onto Big's back. Little Jiang Shui jumped up and hugged his waist. The two dragon eagles flapped their wings and flew back to their residence. Zhou Xuanji looked down and saw Xiao Jinghong sitting on the grass like a statue, motionless. "Sword noble, you are worthy of this title," Zhou Xuanji mumbled to himself. His interaction with Xiao Jinghong made him admire him. Along the way, Zhou Xuanji kept an eye on Xiao Jinghong, in case Xiao Jinghong followed him. After entering the valley, he heaved a sigh of relief when the miasma covered the path. Little Jiang Shui bounced behind him and asked, "Xuanji, are you really going to take the sword noble as your disciple?" She was very excited. That was someone that even Xiao Bailey looked up to. Zhou Xuanji nodded and said, "He already gave me the gift of becoming his disciple, how can I not accept it? But you still have to be careful. There are no absolutely kind people in this world." Little Jiang Shui nodded. Although Zhou Xuanji was young, he was always reasonable. She had already treated him as her backbone. She walked over quickly and hugged his neck from behind. "Xuanji, what do you want to eat tonight?" She giggled. Today, Zhou Xuanji was in the limelight, which made her feel honored. In her eyes, Zhou Xuanji's prestige was her prestige. The two of them were already inseparable. Zhou Xuanji tilted his head and muttered, "Let's drink fish soup." "Okay, I will ask the waiter to fish," Little Jiang Shui said with a smile. After that, she kissed Zhou Xuanji's little face and ran away. Zhou Xuanji wiped the saliva off his face with disdain. This little girl still could not change her bad habits from when she was young. How could she get married in the future? Chapter 28. The next day, Zhou Xuanji brought little Jiang Shui to the appointment. Xiao Jinghong was still meditating at the same place and had not left. Zhou Xuanji began to teach him how to use dual sword wills. The prerequisite for dual sword wills was to multitask. Although Zhou Xuanji had only comprehended it, he had already grasped it and could still explain a little. The first step was for Xiao Jinghong to execute 2 sword techniques with each of his hands. 2 sword techniques? I'm afraid this will be a little difficult. Will I suffer from qi deviation? Xiao Jinghong asked with a frown. And so, Zhou Xuanji showed him again. After reading it, he immediately fell silent and went to practice his sword without saying a word. Little Jiang Shui brought a big and small air to hunt and gather firewood. Zhou Xuanji lay on the grass with a blade of grass in his mouth. He crossed his legs and looked up at the sky, feeling quite satisfied. The blue sky and white clouds were boundless, making people feel carefree. And so, Zhou Xuanji had an additional task every day, which was to guide Xiao Jinghong. During the day, he would guide Xiao Jinghong, and at night, he would return to cultivate. Xiao Jinghong was very patient, and he continued to practice in this mountainous area. Time flew by. Like a white horse galloping past a crack, never to return. Half a year passed. Zhou Xuanji broke through to foundation building level 3, and little Jiang Shui broke through to qi nurturing level 6. It was all thanks to the spirit stones that he was able to move so quickly. Xiao Jinghong was finally able to use two sword techniques at the same time, which made him pleasantly surprised. Not to mention the dual sword intense, just the dual sword techniques alone had greatly increased his strength. The simultaneous execution of the two sword techniques was enough to catch the enemy off guard. At the same time, he tried to use sword will with one hand and another sword art with the other. Although his blood and qi were in a mess and the sword qi was flowing in the opposite direction, he barely succeeded. "Thank you for your guidance, master." Xiao Jinghong held his sword and bowed to Zhou Xuanji, who was lying on the slope. He looked excited. If not for Zhou Xuanji's experience, how could he have mastered such a godly technique in half a year? Zhou Xuanji waved his hand and said indifferently, "With your ability, you will master dual sword wills sooner or later." With Zhou Xuanji's affirmation, Xiao Jinghong was even more delighted. Zhou Xuanji got up with a flip and waved at Xiao Jinghong. Xiao Jinghong immediately walked over and asked, "Master, what's the matter?" Zhou Xuanji looked up and asked, "Why did you come to Gulan Forest?" With Xiao Jinghong's ability, it was not difficult for him to traverse the Gulan Forest. Could it be that he was just passing by? Xiao Jinghong sat beside him and gazed at the sky with misty eyes. He said softly, "I have a battle appointment. In order to become stronger, I'm going to challenge the great demon king in the depths of the Gulan Forest." "What duel?" Zhou Xuanji asked curiously. As for the great demon king of the Gulan Forest, he had also heard of it. It was said that the demon was extremely powerful and had over 1,000,000 demon soldiers under his command. He had once almost destroyed the southern Snow Kingdom. Fortunately, the great Zhou dynasty had sent reinforcements in time. "I've fought with the great Zhou dynasty's Meng Tianlang before, but we weren't able to determine a victor, so we agreed to fight on the border of the great Zhou dynasty in 10 years. There are still 7 years until the 10-year agreement." Xiao Jinghong answered. When he mentioned Meng Tianlang, his eyes were filled with fighting spirit. Zhou Xuanji knew Meng Tianlang. He was the youngest general of cavalry in the great Zhou Empire. He was skilled in the art of war and was famous for defeating many with fewer troops. Emperor Yan of Zhou was very pleased and promoted him to the rank of general. Of course, this had something to do with the Meng clan. After all, the Meng clan was one of the top 5 super clans in the great Zhou Empire. "Oh yeah, I still don't know your name, revered teacher." Xiao Jinghong tilted his head and asked. His eyes were filled with curiosity as he looked at the 7-year-old child beside him. Even the great Zhou prince, Zhou Yalong, was not as devilish as him. This child would surely shake the world in the future. Zhou Xuanji said frankly. "Zhou Xuanji? Good name." Xiao Jinghong nodded and praised. He did not associate Zhou Xuanji with the great Zhou prince. The incident with Lady Zhao Xian was huge, but everyone called Zhou Xuanji the son of Zhao Xian. Only the people in the palace knew his name. Xiao Jinghong got up and said, "It's time for me to leave. Only by fighting can I quickly train myself and master the dual sword wills." Zhou Xuanji got up and said, "I wish you success." Xiao Jinghong smiled at him and said, "After I defeat Meng Tianlang, I will come back to see you." After that, he leaped up and soared 100 meters into the sky. He transformed into a beam of cold light and flew toward the horizon, as fast as lightning. This was the sword noble. He came and went without a trace. Zhou Xuanji smiled and said, "That might not be the case. Maybe we will meet again in Great Zhou." After Xiao Jinghong left, Zhou Xuanji lay down and waited for little Jiang Shui to come back. After a long while, dusk was approaching. Little Jiang Shui had not returned yet. Zhou Xuanji flipped up and frowned. He felt a little uneasy. In the past, little Jiang Shui would have already returned by this time. Screech, the dragon eagle's cry came from the horizon. Ah, Big flew over. It landed in front of Zhou Xuanji quickly. Zhou Xuanji's expression changed because Big's left wing was stained with blood. It was obviously injured. It chirped in bird language, and with his long experience with it, Zhou Xuanji could understand what it meant. Little Jiang Shui and small heir were captured. He first took out some ointment and applied it for Ah Big. He then leaped onto its back and said, "Bring me there." Whoosh! Ah Big flapped its wings and flew in the direction they came from. Zhou Xuanji looked calm, but he was extremely anxious in his heart. If anything happened to little Jiang Shui, he would go crazy. The two of them had been together for 5 years. He had already treated her as his closest family, and he would not allow anyone to hurt her. Shady Mountain Stronghold. This stronghold was one of the mountain strongholds outside the borders of the southern Snow Kingdom. They committed all sorts of atrocities. Shady Mountain Stronghold was located on a lone peak. At this moment, a group of people and horses were advancing on the mountain path. Among them were 3 prisoner carriages. The last prisoner carriage held small heir. It was covered in blood and was lying inside. Chains wrapped around its body, and it could not move at all. The other 2 carriages were filled with people. One was for men, and the other was for women. There were 15 people in total. Little Jiang Shui was among them. She leaned against the corner of the carriage and kept looking at the sky. "Oh no. We are targeted by the Shady Mountain Stronghold. We are dead for sure," a pretty lady in a green dress said in despair. Her eyes were purple, and it was obvious that she had been punched. Tears were streaming down her face. The other 3 women in the carriage were the same. They were in the prime of their youth and beauty. Once they entered the stronghold, it was easy to imagine what would happen to them. The men in the other prisoner carriage were just as hopeless. They were all young cultivators from various sects and clans. The highest cultivation was only at foundation building level 1. They went to the border of Gulan Forest to train, but they did not expect to encounter the Shady Mountain Stronghold. The one in front was a muscular man in black armor. He rode a horse that was 3 meters tall, and he held a huge blade in his hand. The blade was still stained with blood. "Second Chief, although we did not find the 3-eyed drought rodent on this trip, we caught a dragon eagle. This trip was not in vain." A skinny man came over and grinned, revealing a row of disgusting yellow teeth. Chapter 29. The Shady Mountain Stronghold was situated halfway up the mountain. The 3 carriages were escorted to the peak. The peak was surrounded by dozens of buildings, and in the center was an empty field. There were many carriages at the edge, and inside were many messy and tattered captives. Every one of them had blood stains on them, and it was obvious that they had been beaten up. Little Jiang Shui looked at the pitiful captives and trembled in fear. Although she believed that Zhou Xuanji would come to save her, she could not help but be afraid at the sight. She also saw children who were the same age as her, and some were even younger than her. Their eyes were dull, and there was blood at the corner of their mouths. This made her even more afraid. Dragon Eagle? Good stuff. A middle-aged man with a face full of stubble walked to the carriage that held Xiao Air. He rubbed his chin and looked satisfied. This person was tall and wore scale armor. His arms were dark, and his muscles were well-defined. He gave off a barbaric aura. Second Bandit Chief walked up to him and chuckled. "Boss, now you should be satisfied with me, right? Although I did not get the 3-eyed drought rodent, I did not return empty-handed." The head bandit master nodded and said, "Not bad, but did you ask about the origins of the people you captured? We can't capture all of them." The Shady Mountain Stronghold looked majestic, but in Great Zhou, they were only slightly larger ants. The second chief grinned and said, "Don't worry, none of them have troublesome backgrounds." He had asked before, but these captives did not have any powerful backgrounds. The head bandit master grunted in acknowledgement, then turned around and left. The second chief also went back to rest. After about an hour, third bandit chief returned. "Big brother. Second brother. Look, I caught the 3-eyed drought rodent." A coarse laugh was heard, and all the captives turned to look. They saw a bare-chested bald man walking quickly to the peak. Behind him were dozens of bandits. They were escorting 2 carriages with firewood and various herbs tied to them. The chief and second chief walked out of their buildings, and so did the other bandits. It really is the 3-eyed drought rodent. With this rat, it will be much easier for us to find heavenly materials and earthly treasures in the future. Third chief, you really found it. Ha ha ha, our shady mountain stronghold is going to rise. We can't let this news get out. Otherwise, the other strongholds will come to snatch it. The mountain bandits discussed excitedly. The dusk was like a group of demons roaring. 3-eyed drought rodent. The legendary 3-eyed drought rodent that can identify all the treasures in the world, a girl beside little Jiang Shui mumbled softly. Little Jiang Shui turned to look at her. He discovered that this woman was wearing a yellow robe, and her face was covered in dust, making it impossible to see her face clearly. However, her figure was beautiful, and it made one's imagination run wild. Feeling little Jiang Shui's gaze, the lady in yellow turned around and sighed. It's a pity that you have to suffer such misfortune at such a young age. It's all fate. Little Jiang Shui curled her lips but did not say anything. The woman in yellow thought that she was afraid, so she didn't say anything else. The night gradually deepened. One of the bandits opened the wooden door of the prisoner's cart and pulled a pretty girl out. The woman screamed and struggled. The bandit was annoyed and slapped her across the face. The slap resounded through the mountain peak. The woman fainted from the slap, and the bandit dragged her into the second chief's loft. This scene made the female captives feel even more despair. Rather than being humiliated, they might as well just die. Little Jiang Shui hugged her knees and looked at the night sky far away. Her eyes were shining with hope. Time continued to pass. Late at night, little Jiang Shui could not resist the sleepiness and fell asleep. On the mountain peak, the patrolling bandits were all yawning. No one noticed that a small figure was climbing the mountain quietly. It was Zhou Xuanji. He did not descend from the sky but climbed the mountain alone. Relying on the 8-step sword lunge, he avoided the bandit's sight. He stood behind a loft and looked ahead. It was dark at night, and it was difficult for ordinary people to see clearly. But he had the cultivation of foundation building level 3, and his vision was extraordinary. Under the qi obscuring incantation, he did not leak his qi. Soon, he saw little Jiang Shui. He did not act immediately but sensed the qi around him. There were about 10 foundation building cultivators, and 3 of them were much more powerful than him. But they should all be at foundation building. His eyes sparkled, and he made a decision in his heart. He moved toward little Jiang Shui. Relying on the 8-step sword lunge in his petite figure, no one noticed his presence along the way. He bypassed the prisoner's cart and came behind little Jiang Shui. The girl was sleeping soundly, and she did not notice that someone was behind her. Xuanji. I'm afraid, little Jiang Shui suddenly talked in her sleep, which made Zhou Xuanji's heart ache. He did not wake little Jiang Shui up immediately, but he was thinking about how to save her without anyone noticing. He turned around and saw that small heir was tied up in another prisoner's cart, but it was still awake. It stared at Zhou Xuanji with its bright eyes, as though it was a wrong child looking at its father. Zhou Xuanji gestured to it to not make any noise. Vermin of the shady mountain stronghold, tonight, I will do justice on behalf of the heavens and destroy you all. At this moment, a righteous and awe-inspiring cry resounded in the night sky and woke everyone up. A sword gleamed brightly on the mountain peak, and a man in white came riding on his sword. His black hair danced in the wind, and he looked like an immortal descending to the mortal world. Little Jiang Shui was also startled awake. She did not notice Zhou Xuanji, who was behind her, but she looked at the man in white. Zhou Xuanji squatted down to avoid being discovered by the bandits. The head chief, second chief, and third chief walked out one after another with weapons in their hands. I was wondering who it was. So it's Autumn Sword Zhang Ruyu. If your father, Zhang Tianjian, came, he might really be able to destroy my shady mountain stronghold. But you? You're still too young. The head chief said with disdain. He flipped his right hand and smashed the giant hammer into the ground, creating a small crater. I'll kill you. The second chief leaped up with his great blade and slashed at Zhang Ruyu, who was in the air. Zhang Ruyu was expressionless. He used his finger like a sword, and 2 streams of sword chi shot out from his index finger and middle finger. They hit the second chief's great blade and knocked him down. Next, Zhang Ruyu swooped down, and the sword under his feet landed in his hand. A great battle had officially begun. Zhou Xuanji, who was hiding behind the prisoner's cart, rejoiced in his heart. This autumn sword Zhang Ruyu really came at the right time. He nudged little Jiang Shue's back lightly, and she turned around in shock. The next second, she was pleasantly surprised. She looked at Zhou Xuanji's sneaky behavior, and she almost burst into tears. Zhou Xuanji reminded her not to make a sound, but the lady in yellow beside him noticed his arrival. The lady in yellow had a strange look on her face. How did this little brat get up here? Zhou Xuanji noticed her gaze and grinned at her. He then looked at little Jiang Shui and said softly, "When they are in chaos, I will save you." His eyes were flashing with murderous intent. Although he was not a righteous person, he had his own principles. Chapter 30. The bright moon hung high in the sky, and the night was hazy. In the shady mountain stronghold, Zhang Ruyu and the 3 stronghold masters were engaged in a fierce battle. The surrounding bandits were incomparably nervous and did not dare to get close to him. No one noticed that Zhou Xuanji was moving. He first went to the prison cart where Xiao Er was and used the crimson dragon sword to cut the rough wood like he was cutting tofu. Very quickly, he untied Xiao Er and Xiao Er escaped. The man and the eagle sneaked up behind little Jiang Shui. The captives in the carriage also noticed Zhou Xuanji's appearance. They were very excited and did not dare to make a sound. At the juncture of life and death, no fool would make a fuss. Zhou Xuanji swung his sword lightly and slashed out an opening. He then carried little Jiang Shui out, and the others ran out one after another. Later, you guys should hide first. If you want to escape down the mountain, don't act recklessly. Zhou Xuanji instructed, and the group had no objections. He then took out the golden rock sword and handed it to little Jiang Shui. Take this for self-defense. Little Jiang Shui was stunned and asked, "What do you want to do?" With Zhou Xuanji around, why would she need to defend herself? She suddenly thought of something and became nervous. Zhou Xuanji said softly, "These beasts must be eliminated." Seeing the determination in his eyes, little Jiang Shui did not try to persuade him. At the same time, the battle between Zhang Ruyu and the 3 bandit chiefs had reached its climax. The 2nd bandit chiefs and 3rd bandit chiefs were injured. As the son of Zhang Tianjian, Zhang Ruyu's strength was naturally extraordinary. Relying on the sword in his hand, he was able to defeat all his enemies. But Zhou Xuanji could tell that it would be very difficult for Zhang Ruyu to defeat the 3 chiefs. With a thought, the crimson dragon sword and frost wave sword appeared out of thin air. Xiao! Xiao! The 2 divine swords flew in opposite directions. Under the dark night, cold light flashed. The mountain bandits' throats were slit, and they died instantly. In less than 3 breaths of time, more than 100 bandits on the mountain peak had lost their lives. Seeing this, the captives behind Zhou Xuanji were dumbfounded. "Who is it?" The head bandit master, who was in the middle of fighting, shouted angrily. When he saw more than 100 of his men die, he was so furious that he almost fainted. These were the mainstays of Shady Mountain Stronghold. The bandit chief's heart was bleeding. The crimson dragon sword and frost wave sword flew down the mountain, killing the other bandits. After reaching the foundation building stage, Zhou Xuanji's senses were greatly enhanced. He could sense the chi of other bandits. Along the way up the mountain, he had already figured out the situation in the Shady Mountain Stronghold. Miserable screams resounded from the foot of the mountain, making the Shady Mountain Stronghold look like hell. The 3 fort masters were alarmed. Could it be that there was more than one enemy? The second chief flew into a rage and roared at Zhang Ruyu, "Bastard! How dare you cheat?" He actually mobilized the army. Zhang Tianjian was a general of the Southern Snow Kingdom and had hundreds of thousands of soldiers under him. It would not be difficult for him to destroy the Shady Mountain stronghold. Zhang Ruyu was dumbfounded. Were they really sent by my father? Zhou Xuanji stealthily made an opening in the other prisoner carriages, and more captives escaped out. The more people there were, the louder the noise. Even though they were in the midst of battle, the three fort masters could sense that something was off. Seeing Zhou Xuanji's actions, the third chief's eyes turned red in an instant. He charged toward Zhou Xuanji with his two curved blades. In the dark night, he was like a ghost, extremely fast. Zhou Xuanji was not afraid. With the wind-cutter sword in his hand, he stomped on the ground with his right foot and activated the 8-step sword lunge. PFFTT, the third chief's body stopped in an instant. Blood spurted out from his throat like an arrow. Zhou Xuanji appeared behind the third chief. How? How can it be? The third chief opened his eyes wide and said with a trembling voice. Before he could finish his sentence, all his bones and tendons were broken. Countless arrows of blood spurted out from all over his body. Trisource vein severing sword. Severing a meridian with one slash. Zhou Xuanji's cultivation might not be as high as the third chief, but with the 8-step sword lunge and trisource vein severing sword will, he killed the third chief in an instant. The captives were dumbfounded. This kid is so powerful. Little Jiang Shui jumped up from the ground and clapped her hands. She was extremely excited. Her Xuanji is so powerful. The third chief, who looked fierce and invincible, was no match for him at all. Zhang Ruyu, the head chief, and the second chief also noticed the third chief's tragic death. The three of them stopped fighting and distanced themselves from each other. "Who are you?" the head chief asked with gritted teeth. Even he could not kill the third chief in an instant, so he was both shocked and furious. Could he be an enlightening cultivator? He might even be an inner pellet cultivator. Zhou Xuanji walked toward them with his sword in hand, but he heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. If they were to fight face to face, he might not be able to defeat the three chiefs. But he killed the third chief in an instant, and it had already frightened the other two chiefs out of their wits. At this moment, the two chiefs had already begun to demonize Zhou Xuanji's power. "I am Sword God Zhou, and I will enforce justice on behalf of the heavens," Zhou Xuanji said coldly. His childish voice resounded across the mountain top. He charged toward the second chief with the 8-step sword lunge. The head chief wanted to help, but Zhang Ruyu stopped him. Facing the menacing Zhou Xuanji, the second chief was drenched in sweat out of fear. He immediately swung his broadsword and slashed at the ground. Boom! The ground cracked, and the blade chi spread forward like a spider web. It was powerful. Just when Zhou Xuanji landed on the ground, he felt countless needle-like blade chi coming at him. It was enough to crush him into pieces. He was so frightened that he immediately used the 8-step sword lunge again and came to the second chief's side. The night was dark, and the second chief's eyesight was poor, but he could still feel the danger beside him. He roared furiously and slashed with his broadsword. But Zhou Xuanji's wind-cutter sword was faster. The sword flashed, and blood splattered. The second chief's vital channels were severed in an instant, and his life force dissipated immediately. Plop! He knelt on the ground, and he could not be more dead. This scene made the head chief completely terrified. He said with a trembling voice, "Sword God Zhou, we have no enmity with you." Zhang Ruyu was also shocked in his heart. Who was this Sword God Zhou? He was so powerful, but why had he not heard of him before? The most important thing was, this guy seemed to be a child. Zhou Xuanji walked toward the head chief and snorted, "Sword God Zhou, have been killing evil people all my life. You have done evil, so there is enmity between us." After he finished speaking, he charged toward the head chief. He did not feel any pressure killing such an evil person. The head chief was so frightened that he turned around and fled immediately. He quickly came to the edge of the cliff and stomped on the ground. An iron fan appeared under his feet, and he flew away with the wind. This guy escaped so quickly that Zhou Xuanji did not even have time to react. Zhou Xuanji sighed and turned around. Everyone, you can escape now. The 3 chiefs and the elites of Shady Mountain Stronghold were all dead. How could the rest of them withstand the rage of the captives? The captives, who were in a daze, woke up one after another. We are saved. Sword God Zhou is so powerful. He really is the sword god. The 3 evil people could not even withstand a single blow from him. Run. Why run? The Shady Mountain Stronghold will cease to exist from now on. The captives cheered, and some even cried tears of joy. Zhou Xuanji quickly took away the storage bags and rings of the 2nd and 3rd chiefs. Little Jiang Shui and Small Air followed closely behind. Chapter 31. Seeing Zhou Xuanji overturning the buildings, the captives did not stop him, nor did they participate. Zhou Xuanji saved them, so they naturally would not compete with him for the Shady Mountain Stronghold's wealth. Those who could venture into the Gulan forest were definitely not poor people. Seeing that Zhou Xuanji was busy, the captives began conversing and asked each other about sword god Zhou's background. Zhang Ryu did not stay idle. He went down the mountain to eradicate the other bandits. None of the bandits were good people. They might have come up the mountain for various reasons, but no matter what the reason was, it couldn't change their sins. The other side. Zhou Xuanji found a small cage in the bandit chief's house. Inside it was a small rat with yellowish-brown fur. It had big eyes and 2 long golden stripes on its back. Little Jiang Shui's eyes lit up when she saw it. She cried out and pounced on it. Could this be the 3-eyed drought rodent they were talking about? It can identify all the treasures in the world. Little Jiang Shui said to Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji's eyes lit up when he heard this. They had heard Xiao Bailey talk about the strange beasts in the world, and one of them was the 3-eyed drought rodent. Zhou Xuanji immediately swung his sword and released the 3-eyed drought rodent. The 3-eyed drought rodent was so scared that it curled into a ball and shivered. Little Jiang Shui wanted to catch it, but Zhou Xuanji beat her to it. Zhou Xuanji kept it in his bosom and said, "What if this little thing is dangerous?" Little Jiang Shui heard him and quickly retracted her hand. She let Zhou Xuanji tame her first. Then, they continued to plunder. It had to be said that the Shady Mountain Stronghold was really rich. Zhou Xuanji received more than 200,000 spirit stones, and the highest was level 3. Other than that, there were also many treasures, spirit pills, and miraculous medicines. Zhou Xuanji stored them all in the supreme storage. When he arrived at the empty space, the captives had yet to leave. They all looked at Zhou Xuanji with wide eyes. Zhou Xuanji raised his brow. "What? You want to fight with me?" Thump. A man suddenly knelt down and cried out in tears, "Thank you, sword god Zhou." After saying that, he began to kowtow. The other captives knelt down as well and continuously thanked Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji was very powerful, so they treated him as a senior and did not feel ashamed. Seeing how excited they were, Zhou Xuanji sighed in amazement. He suddenly had an idea. That was to eradicate all the bandits in the Gulan forest. Not only would they be able to loot their wealth, but they would also be able to get rid of evil for the people. It could also be used as a whetstone. Zhou Xuanji immediately shouted, "Everyone, please rise. I, sword god Zhou, swear today that I will wipe out all the bandits and tyrants at the border of the southern Snow Kingdom." With that, he left with little Jiang Shui and the waiter. The captives stood up one after another, pleasantly surprised. If what Zhou Xuanji said was true, it would be much less dangerous for them to train in the future. The girl in yellow, who was with little Jiang Shui earlier, gritted her teeth and followed Zhou Xuanji and Zhou Xuanji. Walking down the mountain path, Zhang Ruyu was slaughtering the mountain bandits. The bandits were fleeing in panic. Some of them even jumped off the cliff and fell to their deaths. As they walked, Zhou Xuanji said, "Sister, don't run too far in the future. From tomorrow onwards, you must cultivate more. I will be your sparring partner." "Sure." Little Jiang Shui held Zhou Xuanji's hand and said with a smile. If she became more powerful, she would be able to protect herself and share some of Zhou Xuanji's burden. Of course, she was willing. The three-eyed drought rodent in Zhou Xuanji's arms popped its head out. It looked around timidly but did not run away. The three-eyed drought rodent was a mystical beast with a spirit. It could sense that Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui had no ill intentions, so it did not run away. The captives followed behind them and did not dare to get close. After Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui left the mountain, a big flew over from afar. It went up to Little Air and rubbed its head against its sister. Zhou Xuanji checked on Little Air's injuries and found that it could already fly. Just when they were about to leave, Zhang Ruyu walked over. He cupped his fist with his sword and said, "Senior Sword God Zhou, thank you for your help." He was not deceived by Zhou Xuanji's appearance, but he was bewitched by his sword will. He thought that Zhou Xuanji was a powerful cultivator who had surpassed the foundation building stage, so he addressed him as a senior. Zhou Xuanji glanced at him and said, "I should be the one thanking you." "You flatter me, you flatter me." Zhang Ruyu was overwhelmed by the favor. Zhou Xuanji's prowess made him feel like he was facing his own father. When he faced the second chief and third chief, he killed them with one slash. Such power, it was simply, even though it was late at night, that slash amazed him. He even felt that Zhou Xuanji's sword was even more charming than Zhang Tianjian's. It was the sword that he yearned for. Fast and yet shocking. Just when he was about to say more, Zhou Xuanji leaped onto Big's back and pulled little Jiang Shui up. The lady in yellow, who had been following closely behind, suddenly walked up to Big and knelt down. She gritted her teeth and said, "Sword God Zhou, please take me in. I am willing to be your servant." Zhou Xuanji had already noticed her following him, but he did not expect her to want to be his servant. This lady's cultivation was at Qi Nurturing level 8, which was not too high, but not too weak either. But why did he bring her along? He shook his head and said, "I don't need a servant." The lady in yellow became anxious and said, "I can do anything you want me to." Zhang Ruyu's expression became teasing. Although this lady's face was dirty, she had a good figure. Which normal man could reject her? Zhou Xuanji shook his head. He squeezed his legs, and Big spread its wings and flew away. Little Air followed closely behind. The lady in yellow was a little stunned. She immediately got up and chased after Big and Small Air. Zhang Ruyu looked at Zhou Xuanji's back and sighed in amazement, a dragon eagle under him. Sword God Zhou. The captive sighed in amazement too. Without Sword God Zhou, they could not imagine what would have happened to them. Late at night, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui returned to the valley. Little Jiang Shui first checked Little Air's injuries, while Zhou Xuanji took out the three-eyed drought rodent. "How about you follow me from now on?" Zhou Xuanji tapped the three-eyed drought rodent's little nose with his index finger and asked. The three-eyed drought rodent nodded blankly and took the initiative to rub his hand to show intimacy. Zhou Xuanji smiled satisfactorily and did not bother about it anymore. He poured out all of his gains for the day and began to count them. Other than spirit stones and elixirs, there were many enchanted artifacts, energy techniques, spells, and so on. He called little Jiang Shui over and asked her to pick. For the next period of time, they did not have to leave the valley. Usually, Big and Small Air would go out to hunt. Just as they were concentrating on their cultivation, the legend of Sword God Zhou began to spread to the southern Snow Kingdom. Every month, Zhou Xuanji would go out and destroy a stronghold. He purposely chose the weaker strongholds, where the most powerful one was no more than foundation building. He destroyed them easily and looted their treasures. Half a year passed. He destroyed 4 strongholds and rescued thousands of captives and slaves. The name of sword god Zhou was gradually deified, because the stronghold lords were all killed by him with one slash. Those captives and slaves who witnessed it with their own eyes began to praise him after they returned to the southern Snow Kingdom. Chapter 32. Ding! Congratulations, the sword owner has obtained silver, heaven melody sword, profound green lotus seed. When Zhou Xuanji was 8 years old, he received another legendary sword. And it was a silver divine sword. 3 lines of words appeared in front of him. Sword name, Heaven Sound Sword, level, silver, description, forged from the heavenly sound stone. When the blade vibrates, it will produce heavenly sound that confuses the opponent's mind. With a thought, the Heaven Sound sword appeared in his hand. The sword was silver in color and extremely dazzling. 2 silver snakes coiled around the hilt with their mouths facing downwards. He waved the sword, and a buzzing sound rang out. It was very magical. After that, he brought up his attribute list. Sword owner, Zhou Xuanji race, Great Zhou royal bloodline age, 8 cultivation, 4th stage foundation building realm cultivation method, golden body incantation sword art, white crane sword art, blazing flame sword art, 8-step sword steps, trisource vein severing sword, supernatural power, none, talent, doing 2 things at once swords, silver, crimson dragon sword, bronze, frost wave sword, silver, bloodbath sword, bronze, tiger roar sword, bronze, wind cutter sword, iron, swine culling sword, silver, golden rock sword, silver, heaven sound sword. In half a year, his cultivation level had broken through to foundation building stage 4, while little Jiang Shui had reached Qi nurturing stage 8. With the help of spirit stones, their cultivation speed was naturally fast. After reaching 8 years of age, there was an additional age in the attribute list. It seemed that as he grew stronger, his attribute list would also become richer. What a pity! When will a gold or amethyst divine sword appear? Zhou Xuanji curled his lip and thought regretfully. Silver divine swords all had their own characteristics. They were very powerful and were enough for him to use. But the human heart is always greedy. Sword spirit, what is the profound green lotus seed? Zhou Xuanji asked curiously in his heart. 1 legendary sword per year was the minimum. If there were no other surprises, then this birthday would be a little boring. It's a treasure that can refine the body and purify the mind. It's best to eat it raw. The sword spirit replied, and the ebony heart green lotus appeared in Zhou Xuanji's hand. It was a green plant without leaves, and it had 6 green seeds the size of a thumb. Zhou Xuanji immediately shouted, "Sister! Come here." He sat by the lake while little Jiang Shui was busy fixing the swing. Last night, small air broke the swing. Little Jiang Shui loved to play on the swing, and at night, she could hug Zhou Xuanji and play with him like a toy. Naturally, her heart ached when the swing was broken. Zhou Xuanji did not like being tortured by her, so he did not help. "What?" little Jiang Shui shouted. Then, she angrily walked behind Zhou Xuanji with her hands on her waist and her cheeks puffed up into 2 small balls. She looked very unhappy. Zhou Xuanji ignored her expression and said, "Here, these are ebony heart green lotus seeds. They're good for your body. 3 for each of us." Little Jiang Shui squatted down and asked curiously, "Where did you get it from?" Zhou Xuanji directly tore off one and put it into his mouth, chewing. In the next second, his expression changed drastically. "Holy shit! Is there sh*t in it? So disgusting." Zhou Xuanji almost vomited. Seeing his expression, she turned and left. "Wait!" Zhou Xuanji quickly got up and caught up with her with the 8-step sword lunge. He hugged little Jiang Shui and quickly fed her an ebony heart green lotus seed. Little Jiang Shui chewed it instinctively, and her expression was the same as his. She wanted to spit it out, but Zhou Xuanji covered her mouth. This is a saint herb. Don't waste it. Look at me. Zhou Xuanji said quickly. After that, he swallowed the ebony heart green lotus seed. He pulled back his hand and tore off another 2 ebony heart green lotus seeds, chewing them in his mouth. Little Jiang Shui was skeptical. Just when she was about to ask, she suddenly felt the ebony heart green lotus seeds turning into a stream of coolness that seeped into her meridians. Zhou Xuanji felt it too. He immediately sat down with his legs crossed and began to channel his energy. Seeing this, little Jiang Shui sat down as well. The seemingly small fruit contained such a massive amount of energy. Zhou Xuanji was excited. He felt that he could master the second level of golden body incantation, metal body. Spiritual qi gathered and flowed into Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui's bodies. An hour later, Zhou Xuanji broke through to foundation building level 5 and mastered metal body at the same time. His skin had a faint metallic luster. Little Jiang Shui also ate 3 ebony heart green lotus seeds, and her cultivation reached qi nurturing level 10 straight away. After the breakthrough, Zhou Xuanji felt that he was covered in mud, so he got up and prepared to take a bath in the pool. Little Jiang Shui got up and ran toward him. She hooked her arms around his neck and giggled, "Xuanji, you are so nice." Zhou Xuanji said with disdain, "You are so sticky and ugly. Stay away from me." "I won't. I want to rub against you." "Oh my God, you are a girl, you can't do this." "Little brother, are you scared? Come, I will rub against you more." "Get lost." The two of them entered the pool, fooling around. Zhou Xuanji was having a headache. Is this girl going through puberty? She is getting more and more mischievous. Teasing him. Southern Snow Kingdom, Royal City, Zhang Residence. In the courtyard, Zhang Ruyu was practicing his sword techniques. His father, Zhang Tianjian, sat in the stone pavilion, drinking wine while watching his son practice. He nodded and shook his head occasionally. At this moment, a soldier in metal armor ran in. He entered the stone pavilion and knelt down on one knee. "General, I have more information about Sword God Zhou." Zhang Tianjian put down his wine cup and said, "Speak." Zhang Ruyu, who was practicing his sword techniques, stopped and listened carefully. 3 days ago, Qing Fenglong, who was at foundation building level 10, was beheaded by Sword God Zhou on Crimson Brow Peak. More than half of the 1,200 bandits on the mountain died. The soldier said with a deep voice. He sounded a little surprised. Although Qing Fenglong was at foundation building level 10, he was famous for killing a powerful cultivator at the enlightening stage. Zhang Tianjian squinted his eyes and asked, "How many moves did Sword God Zhou use?" According to the rescued person, Sword God Zhou used 2 moves. One instant kill, the other beheading. The soldier replied, and Zhang Tianjian's expression changed slightly. Zhang Tianjian asked, "As usual, Sword God Zhou looted all the treasures on Crimson Brow Peak?" The soldier nodded, "Yes." Not a single spirit stone was left. Zhang Tianjian laughed coldly and said with disdain, "Benevolent and righteous Sword God Zhou, you don't live up to your name." Benevolent and righteous Sword God Zhou. This was how the rescued person described Zhou Xuanji. After Zhou Xuanji killed the enemy, he saved the people first before looting the treasures, so that the rescued person could feel his kindness. "Father, Sword God Zhou is really benevolent and righteous." Zhang Ruyu said unhappily. Sword God Zhou was his idol, how could he tolerate Zhang Tianjian's doubt? Zhang Tianjian stared at him and said, "Don't be fooled by his appearance. A true grandmaster of the sword's way will not be so shameless." Zhang Ruyu was furious and said, "Father, Sword God Zhou's sword is really worthy of the title Sword God. If you encounter him, you might not win." With this, Zhang Tianjian's face turned cold immediately. He was the top sword cultivator in the Southern Snow Kingdom. Chapter 33. Bomb. Zhang Tianjian slammed the table and snorted coldly. If he encounters me, I will make sure that he will not dare to draw his sword again in 3 moves. Zhang Ruyu laughed with disdain. He realized that his father was becoming more and more arrogant. Did he forget the humiliation he suffered in front of the sword monarch? He did not dare to mention it, but it was a humiliation to him too. When he participated in the imperial examinations in the Great Zhou Empire, he was often mocked by the young cultivators in the empire. So he always held a grudge against his father. But in the southern Snow Kingdom, Zhang Tianjian was indeed the top sword cultivator. He had always set Zhang Tianjian as his goal. But ever since he met Sword God Zhou, every time he heard about Sword God Zhou's raid, his blood would boil. Gradually, Sword God Zhou's position in his heart surpassed Zhang Tianjian's. In his eyes, Sword God Zhou was the same as him. They both had a burning kindness in their hearts. On the other hand, Zhang Tianjian did not go to raid the bandits himself but mocked Sword God Zhou instead. In comparison, his character was bad. Then why don't you go? Zhang Ruyu rolled his eyes. Sword God Zhou went around raiding bandits, so it was easy to encounter him. As long as Zhang Tianjian wanted to, he would surely encounter him. According to his estimation, Sword God Zhou and his father should be evenly matched, so he was not worried that one of them would die. Humph, the demons are getting restless. How can I leave? Zhang Tianjian snorted. His tone was a little serious. Zhang Ruyu rolled his eyes and walked behind the soldier. Is Sword God Zhou in Great Zhou's reputation ranking? He asked. Great Zhou's reputation ranking was a ranking of influential people. It was not about power, but fame. The soldier shook his head and said, not yet. Zhang Ruyu heard him and felt a little regretful. When Zhang Tianjian saw his son's expression, he was infuriated. He was thinking about when to settle the score with Sword God Zhou, to show his son that his father was more powerful. On a small path in the valley, Zhou Xuanji walked in with big. He was covered in blood and had a murderous aura. He went to raid another stronghold just now. The blood on him was the blood of his enemies. Another half a year had passed since his 8th birthday. After raiding so many strongholds, he suddenly wanted to challenge an enlightening cultivator. Although he was only at foundation building level 5, his actual battle power was already enough to defeat all other foundation building cultivators. Now, his combat experience was very rich, and he was no longer the 2-year-old child from back then. He activated the mechanism, and the miasma enveloped the small path. Zhou Xuanji prepared to take a bath. He looked over and saw little Jiang Shui training, while small air chased after the 3-eyed drought rodent. He smiled and walked into the pool. This pool was connected to an underground river. The water in the pool was constantly flowing and could always be kept clean. However, the water they drank was not from this pool, but from the spring that flowed down from the side of the mountain. After washing up, he changed into a new set of clothes and threw the dirty clothes aside. Then, he walked straight to little Jiang Shui. He approached little Jiang Shui and asked, "How is it? Have you broken through?" Little Jiang Shui opened her eyes and revealed a distressed expression. She said, "No, I can't find a way to break through." At the age of 12, she would grow taller and more beautiful every month. Her hair was tied into a ponytail, and she looked very cute when she tilted her head. Zhou Xuanji put his hands on his waist and said proudly, "Take it slow. You are not a genius like me after all." Little Jiang Shui heard him and immediately pounced at Zhou Xuanji with her claws and fangs bared. In a moment of carelessness, Zhou Xuanji was pushed to the ground by her. She sat on his waist and pressed him down. "You want to show off again?" she said proudly. With Zhou Xuanji's strength, he could easily flip her over, but he never did that. He let little Jiang Shui do whatever she wanted to him. With a bitter face, he said, "What kind of big sister are you? You loved me so much when we were young, and now you only know how to abuse me." Little Jiang Shui slapped his butt, as though she was riding a horse. "Who asked you to insult me?" The two began to play around. After the time it took for a joss stick to burn, little Jiang Shui stood up in satisfaction and walked towards the side of the pond. She washed all of Zhou Xuanji's clothes. As long as there was fabric, she would knit clothes for him. She was even more meticulous than her own clothes. Zhou Xuanji was a little depressed. He tidied his messy hair and ran over to bully small air. This was the daily life of the two. Although it repeated day after day, they did not feel bored. Time passed. Half a year passed. Zhou Xuanji broke through to foundation building level 6, and little Jiang Shui also successfully broke through to foundation building level 1. Analyzed that the sword owner has reached 9 years old. Gotcha started. Ding. Congratulations, the sword owner obtained, gold, Hell King sword, ranged sword propelling, flaming fan. The sword spirit's voice came one after another, which made Zhou Xuanji, who was swaying on the swing, jump up immediately. Damn! A gold-grade legendary sword. Zhou Xuanji was so excited that his body trembled. He finally got a gold-grade legendary sword. Next, information about the Hell King sword appeared in front of his eyes. Sword name, Hell King sword grade, gold description. Hell King sword contains the power of the abyss. It can summon the soul of the Hell King to possess it. Hell King? It sounded very awesome. Zhou Xuanji immediately took out the Hell King sword. The sword was 1.5 meters long. The hilt was silver black in color, and there were many tiny patterns that looked like scales. The blade was 3 fingers wide, and the lower end was longer and wider. Overall, it looked majestic and gave off an indescribable sense of dominance. It was indeed a gold-grade legendary sword. It was different from other legendary swords. Zhou Xuanji was in a good mood. He held the Hell King sword, which was longer than him, and began swinging it around. Because the blade was too long, he was not used to it. As he swung the Hell King sword, his aura was more powerful than before. Even little Jiang Shui, who was knitting, was shocked. Another new sword? Little Jiang Shui mumbled to herself before lowering her head again. She was not interested in swords. Because she had no talent in the way of the sword, she did not like swords. After practicing the white crane sword technique, Zhou Xuanji stopped. He wanted to see the ranged sword propelling and the flaming fan first, and then try out the effects of Hell King possession. The ranged sword propelling was a sword technique that could kill enemies from 100 miles away. The flaming fan was an enchanted artifact. Its cross-section looked like a gourd, and its entire body was crimson red. The sword spirit did not allow him to use other enchanted artifacts other than swords, in case he became dependent on them. Zhou Xuanji did not want to use the flaming fan, so he gave it to little Jiang Shui. Little Jiang Shui injected her spirit energy into it and fanned at the empty space in front of her. With a loud sound, a wave of flames was fanned out, enough to engulf a big or small air. It was very destructive. This is great. With this flaming fan, I can help you in the future. Little Jiang Shui said in surprise. She hugged the flaming fan and could not bear to let it go. Zhou Xuanji was also very pleased. This girl seemed to have the potential to become a wizard. Shortly after, he began practicing the ranged sword propelling. The ranged sword propelling only had one move, which was the throwing of the sword. However, the hand gestures and the method of injecting spirit energy into it had its own way of doing things. To Zhou Xuanji, it was just a piece of cake. Chapter 34. After throwing the Hell King sword 500 times, Zhou Xuanji mastered the ranged sword propelling. Controlling the sword with his heart, his consciousness transformed into the Hell King sword. With one slash, he penetrated the mountain and the forest outside. It was extremely powerful. Little Jiang Shui walked to the hole in the mountain wall. Through the small hole, she could see the forest on the other side of the mountain. She could not help but swallow her saliva. With such power, how terrifying would it be if he threw the sword at someone? She turned around and looked at him as though she was looking at a little monster. Zhou Xuanji raised his right hand with his palm facing the sky and smiled proudly. Am I handsome? Piak. The Hell King's sword pierced through the leaves above and landed in his hand. His body was straight and handsome. Zhou Xuanji even raised his brow and waited for little Jiang Shui to praise him. Little Jiang Shui rolled her eyes and said, "Little one, you only know how to be cocky." Little one, Zhou Xuanji felt as though he was struck by lightning. He wanted to retort instinctively. But when he thought about it carefully, it made sense. He was only 9 years old. He was indeed a little one. He could not help but feel defeated. When could he grow up? Seeing his bitter face, little Jiang Shui walked up to him and comforted him by patting his head. It's okay. It's good to be like this. You're so cute. What if you become disabled when you grow up? This was what Zhou Xuanji often teased little Jiang Shui. He said that she was cute when she was young but would become disabled when she grew up. Zhou Xuanji curled his lip and sighed. I really want to grow up faster. Little Jiang Shui asked curiously, why? What do you want to do when you grow up? Zhou Xuanji replied, I want to marry a dozen wives and concubines first. He was only joking. He did not have much interest in women. Little Jiang Shui heard him and pinched his cheeks. She snorted, You're so young, yet you don't learn good things. She was not the only one who interacted with Zhou Xuanji, so she naturally knew what wives and concubines meant. But she did not think too much about it, because she still did not understand what marriage meant. The couples in Green River Village said that marriage meant a lifetime of companionship, never leaving each other. A pair of people for life. Zhou Xuanji spent a week to completely adapt to the Hell King's sword. When he summoned the Hell King's possession of the Hell King's sword, his entire body would be entwined with a strange black aura. A layer of illusory shadow would be attached to the surface of his body. It was the Hell King. After being possessed by the Nether King, his spiritual power, strength, and speed had all greatly increased, including his senses. At that time, little Jiang Shui was scared out of her wits. She thought that he was possessed. This day, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui rode on a big and small air and left the valley. They were ready to enter the southern Snow Kingdom for a stroll. Now, Zhou Xuanji was overflowing with wealth, so he naturally could not live like a savage anymore. As long as he didn't expose his identity, he shouldn't be discovered by the lackeys of the Empress of Great Zhou. After flying for half a day, when they were near the southern Snow Kingdom city gates, Zhou Xuanji asked a big and small air to stop. They could not bring 2 dragon eagles into the city, it would be too ostentatious. Return to the valley directly, lest you get captured. Got it? Zhou Xuanji instructed the 2 dragon eagles. The 2 little guys from back then were already very majestic and were as tall as a 2-story building. Ada and Little Air nodded, then turned around and flapped their wings to leave. Little Jiang Shui held his little hand and asked, Xuanji, when are we going back to Green River Village to take a look? Green River Village was located outside the borders of the southern Snow Kingdom. It was a wilderness. If they wanted to go back, the fastest way was to cross the southern Snow Kingdom. If not, it would take too much time to walk around the border. Zhou Xuanji tilted his head and said, Do you miss your grandma? To be honest, he did not want to go back. He was afraid that little Jiang Shui would be abducted by her grandma. But that would be too selfish. If little Jiang Shui wanted to go back, he would surely accompany her. Little Jiang Shui looked into his eyes and seemed to be able to guess his thoughts. She curled her lip and said, A little. I just want to know how she is doing now. Forget it, it's too far away. Without Chiu Bailey to lead the way, it would be difficult for them to find Green River Village without half a year. When I break through to the enlightening stage, we will go back. How about that? Zhou Xuanji muttered. When he reached the enlightening stage, it was time for him to take action. He wanted to find out about Lady Zhao Xian's whereabouts first. If she was alive, he wanted to see her. If she was dead, he wanted to see her corpse. She was his biological mother in this life. He should at least erect a monument for her. After that, he planned to participate in Great Zhou's heaven selection. He wanted to appear before Emperor Yan of Zhou with another identity. He wanted to use his talent to attract Emperor Yan of Zhou. As long as his potential was higher than Zhou Yalong's, he would have the opportunity to enter the Great Zhou royal palace and find an opportunity to kill the empress. At that time, even if Emperor Yan of Zhou was furious, he would have to consider if it was worth it to kill him. To be fair, Emperor Yan of Zhou liked him a lot. Every time Emperor Yan of Zhou, who was usually cold and stern, visited him and Lady Zhao Xian, he was always full of smiles. He remembered that Emperor Yan of Zhou once told Lady Zhao Xian that if Zhou Xuanji's talent was outstanding, it was not impossible for him to become the crown prince. Perhaps it was because of this sentence that Lady Zhao Xian's clan was exterminated. Both of them had their own thoughts and began walking toward the border custom. Along the way, little Jiang Shui peeked at him secretly. Zhou Xuanji was thinking about his revenge plan and did not notice the look in her eyes. No matter what, I have to accompany Zhou Xuanji. Without me, no one will knit clothes for him. Little Jiang Shui's eyes became gentle. If not for Zhou Xuanji, she might have fallen into a tragic fate because of her grandmother's debt. She thought about the time they spent together all these years, and how Zhou Xuanji fought for her while bathed in blood. She felt that she could not let him down. Zhou Xuanji was more important than her grandmother. After walking for an hour, they finally arrived at the border custom. To enter, they had to pay 2 level 1 spirit stones and register their identity. Such a threshold was to prevent refugees from other countries from flooding in. Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui did not look like bad people. Moreover, they looked like a golden couple, which made people think that they were disciples of some clan. The guards at the custom accepted the spirit stones and let them pass. After entering the custom, the two of them looked ahead and saw the silhouette of a city 10,000 meters away. There were soldiers training nearby. All of them were bare-chested and looked imposing. There were many people on the road. Some entered the custom, and some came out. After walking for 500 meters, a young man who was about to exit saw Zhou Xuanji and was stunned. He rubbed his eyes and looked pleasantly surprised. He immediately walked up to Zhou Xuanji and said excitedly, "Sword God Zhou. Why are you here?" In the past year and a half, Zhou Xuanji had destroyed 38 strongholds and saved nearly 2,000 people. This young man was one of them. But Zhou Xuanji did not remember him. The young man saw that Zhou Xuanji was frowning and thought that he was being rude. He quickly said softly, "Sir, are you entering the Southern Snow Kingdom to accept a challenge?" Zhou Xuanji looked young, but he did not really think that Zhou Xuanji was a kid. This senior must have mastered the art of rejuvenating one's youth. He had seen Zhou Xuanji's sword technique before, and the elegance of that stroke was still etched in his heart. Zhou Xuanji was a little stunned and asked, "Accept what challenge?" Chapter 35. Northern Sword Valiant? Zhou Xuanji was dumbfounded. Who was this? Little Jiang Shui, on the other hand, frowned. She naturally did not like Northern Valiant Sword's arrogance. The young man hurriedly introduced, "This person does not belong to the Southern Snow Kingdom. He broke through to the Enlightening Realm 4 years ago. His swordsmanship is domineering and he is very strong. He is also very arrogant. He was once on the Great Zhou ranking list, although it was only for a short period of time. Breaking through to the Enlightening Realm 4 years ago?" Zhou Xuanji squinted his eyes. He wanted to challenge an enlightening cultivator. He asked, "Is Northern Valiant Sword still waiting in Cloud Swallow City?" The young man nodded and said, "He said he will wait for another month. If you don't accept the challenge, then the title of Sword God Zhou will be a joke." Towards the end, his tone became indignant. Compared to Sword God Zhou, what was Northern Valiant's sword? What sword god Zhou was most respected for was not his power, but his benevolence. At the thought of this, the young man looked at Zhou Xuanji with a burning passion in his eyes, anticipating that he could defeat Northern Sword Valiant. Zhou Xuanji nodded and said, "Many thanks." With that, he led little Jiang Shui forward. The young man did not chase after him. Instead, he shouted, "You must accept the challenge. Teach him a lesson." Zhou Xuanji waved his hand without looking back. His gaze suddenly turned deep. Northern Sword Valiant? This young master will come and teach you a lesson soon. After walking for a few hundred meters, little Jiang Shui asked in a low voice, "Xuanji, are you confident?" After spending 7 years with Zhou Xuanji, how could she not tell what he was thinking? Zhou Xuanji rolled his eyes at her and said, "When I was 2 years old, I killed an inner pellet cultivator. You are just an enlightening cultivator, why would I be afraid?" Little Jiang Shui thought about it carefully and felt that it made sense. The title of Sword God Zhou was not just for show. The bandits who died under Zhou Xuanji's sword could form an army. Then you have to teach him a good lesson. This kind of arrogant person is the most annoying. Of course. The two of them chatted as they walked toward the city ahead. After entering the city, the two brats began to run all over the streets. It was Zhou Xuanji's first time walking through this world's streets, and he felt that it was quite novel. The two of them were busy buying snacks and strolling through various shops. They seemed to be very excited. For 3 consecutive days, the two of them toured the entire city. Zhou Xuanji's supreme storage contained countless gold, silver, and jewels. The two of them could buy whatever they wanted without hesitation. During this period, they were targeted by some villains, but they were all dealt with by Zhou Xuanji in the alleys. On the 4th day, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui sat on a carriage toward Cloud Swallow City. The Cloud Swallow City was not far from this city. The name of Sword God Zhou was the most popular at the border of the southern Snow Kingdom. Northern Valiant Sword would naturally be closer to the border. There were a total of 7 carriages, and each carriage had 2 coachmen, 1 old and 1 young. The young man was here to gain experience. "Master, do you think Sword God Zhou will accept the challenge?" "I guess Sword God Zhou doesn't even know about this. If not, why do you think Northern Sword Valiant chose Cloud Swallow City?" Are you saying that Northern Sword Valiant was bragging?" "Of course. But Northern Sword Valiant is indeed powerful, while Sword God Zhou can only defeat foundation building bandits. It's hard to tell who will win. I heard that Sword God Zhou is a kid who is not even 10 years old. Is that true?" In the carriage, Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui listened to the discussion outside. They looked at each other and smiled. Little Jiang Shui said softly, "Xuanji, I didn't expect you to be so famous already." She was filled with pride in her heart because the famous sword god Zhou was her younger brother. Zhou Xuanji was playing with a mask. The mask was plated with silver, and only his eyes could be seen. His facial features looked very majestic. He bought this mask with 2 pieces of silver, and it was said that it had been tempered 1,000 times. He smiled and said, "Not really famous." He was the prince of Great Zhou. A small empire was nothing in his eyes. He put on the silver mask and asked with a smile, "Am I handsome?" As he spoke, he struck a pose that he thought was handsome. Pfft, little Jiang Shui could not hold back her laughter. She covered her mouth with one hand and pointed at Zhou Xuanji with the other. "You look so silly." Zhou Xuanji heard her and immediately felt depressed. He was still too young. He was still far from being handsome. When he grew up, he would definitely be a dashing and handsome young master. Little Jiang Shui took out a set of black clothes from her storage ring and said, "Change into this and try it." Zhou Xuanji was still wearing the clothes that she knitted, which looked very plain. These few days, they bought many clothes in the city, and it was just the right time to change into them. As sword god Zhou, his image could not be too shabby. As the saying goes, clothes make the man, and gold makes the Buddha. After changing into a set of exquisite black clothes, Zhou Xuanji's entire aura became sharp and fierce. There were many golden lines on the black clothes. Most of his hair was tied up at the back of his head, but 2 strands of long hair were left on both sides of his forehead, reaching his collarbone. Zhou Xuanji put on the silver mask again. Little Jiang Shui's eyes brightened, and she praised, "This suits the image of sword god Zhou. But it's still too young." Even though his aura was outstanding, Zhou Xuanji's height was still there. But everyone knew that sword god Zhou had the body of a child, so it did not affect him much. Zhou Xuanji took off his mask. With little Jiang Shui's praise, his mood became better. The two began to chat. During this period, they talked about Xiao Jinghong. They did not know how powerful Zhou Xuanji's cheap disciple was. In front of Xiao Jinghong, Northern Sword Valiant would not even dare to fart. The group continued to move forward. They did not encounter any robbers along the way. After 2 days and 2 nights, they arrived at Cloud Swallow City. Cloud Swallow City was one of the largest cities in the southern Snow Kingdom. It had a population of 1 million. There were many clans, and the trade was flourishing. Walking on the street, Zhou Xuanji sensed many foundation building qi. A kingdom was not a mortal kingdom. Most people had cultivation, but it was usually very low. Below the kingdoms, there were mortal kingdoms. They were located between the kingdoms, and cultivation was not widespread yet. Along the way, they heard many people talking about Sword God Zhou and Northern Sword Valiant. Ever since Northern Sword Valiant declared war in a high-profile manner a month ago, more people came to Cloud Swallow City. After all, Northern Sword Valiant was an expert in the way of the sword, while Sword God Zhou appeared out of nowhere. If the two of them were to fight, it would be an exciting battle. Zhou Xuanji was not in a hurry to accept the challenge. He brought little Jiang Shui around the city first. On the other side, at the center of Cloud Swallow City, there was the biggest training ground in the city. The training ground was 1.5 meters tall and 100 yards wide. Behind it was the Lord's residence, while the other 3 sides led to different streets. At this moment, on the training ground, there was an eye-catching silhouette. It was Northern Sword Valiant. His scabbard was placed vertically on the ground, and the tip of his foot was stepping on the hilt. He did not move at all, which made the passers-by exclaim in their hearts. This posture was not simple. Even a cultivator at the qi nurturing stage could not do it. And he had maintained it for a month. In the crowd, Zhang Ruyu curled his lip and cursed softly, "What a tiger." Chapter 36. Northern Sword Valiant stood tall and straight. His black hair was mixed with a few strands of white hair. He wore a long black robe with a white shirt over it. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and closed his eyes. His temperament was cold like a cold sword. Hundreds of people gathered around the training ground. They pointed at Northern Sword Valiant and discussed. How long is he going to wait? He is Northern Sword Valiant. He feels so powerful. I heard that Northern Sword Valiant can split a mountain with one slash. I don't think Sword God Zhou dares to come. Yeah, Sword God Zhou is just a greedy person. There are so many strongholds in Gulan Forest, but he only picked a foundation building stage chief to fight. This means that he is only at foundation building. Northern Sword Valiant has already understood the sword will. He might be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with General Zhang in the future. Most people were in awe of Northern Sword Valiant. Other than those who were saved by Sword God Zhou, many snorted when they heard about Sword God Zhou. This time, Northern Sword Valiant challenged Sword God Zhou, but he did not appear. This made people despise Sword God Zhou even more. At the same time, they admired Northern Sword Valiant. This was a powerful cultivator who forced his opponent to not dare to fight. Among the crowd, there were 2 people. They were Xiao Qingfeng and Ms. Jishui, who had been searching for Zhao Xian's son. They had been searching for Zhou Xuanji for years and had not given up. When are we going back? Ms. Jishui asked. In her heart, she felt that Prince Xuanji was already dead, and there was no point in continuing the search. Xiao Qingfeng stared at Northern Sword Valiant and said, let's wait for another month. I want to see who this sword god Zhou is. I heard that his body is like a 10-year-old child. Ms. Jishui asked, you think he is Prince Xuanji? Xiao Qingfeng shook his head and laughed, how is that possible? Sword god Zhou can defeat all foundation building stage cultivators. Even the second prince who built his foundation at the age of 9 could not defeat all foundation building stage cultivators. Is there someone more devilish than the second prince in this world? Ms. Jishui heard and felt that it was impossible. After all, they had been out for so many years, and they were not in a hurry to go back. Of Zhou Xuanji. People came and went around the martial arts arena, but only a few people stayed. Even Zhang Ryu came here once in a while. On the west side of the training field, in a guest room on the 3rd floor of an inn, a man in purple with a bamboo hat stood in front of the window, looking at Northern Sword Valiant from afar. Inside the room, there was an old man sitting in front of a table. The old man had a stooped figure and a slightly fat body. He was holding a braised pork knuckle with both hands and eating it with relish. Upon closer inspection, one would discover a squirrel-like tail protruding from his back. Demon. Demons that could transform into human form were comparable to human inner pellet experts. Young master, stop looking. Is a mere enlightening realm worth your attention? The old man said vaguely while gnawing on the pork elbow. The purple-robed man did not answer him. After a long while, the purple-clothed man turned around and sat on the bed. He stared at the old man and said, Old Qing, can you not be like a pig? The old man with the pine tail, who was addressed as Old Qing, almost choked on his pork. He felt wronged. Young master, why are you scolding me? The purple-clothed man snorted coldly. Remember our mission, capture Princess Xuanya. Royal father will soon declare war on the southern Snow Kingdom and the surrounding kingdoms. We must have a bargaining chip to restrain the great Zhou dynasty. Old Qing licked the oil off his hand and asked in confusion, Princess Xuanya is only 15 years old. What can she do? The purple-clothed man replied, let me tell you. Great Zhou's Princess Xuanya has the manifestation of Tao Constitution, which is only seen once in 1,000 years. Her talent is second only to Zhou Yalong. Do you think Emperor Yan of Zhou values her? Old Qing opened his eyes wide and gasped. Shortly after, he seemed to have thought of something and asked in astonishment, if she's so talented, why did she come to Cloud Swallow City? The purple-clothed man did not reply, because he was also confused about this. Shopkeeper, give us a guest room. Zhou Xuanji walked to the counter and shouted. He threw a silver ingot on the table. Little Jiang Shui followed behind him and looked out of the inn. She looked through the door and saw the training field at the end of the street. She could already see Northern Sword Valiant. He really knew how to act cool. She curled her lips and felt a little indignant. 2 young guests, please follow me. A waiter ran over and said with a flattering smile. Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui were dressed like ordinary people. Under the waiter's guidance, the 2 of them came to a guest room on the 2nd floor that faced the training field. Zhou Xuanji was very generous. He gave the waiter some money, and the waiter nodded and bowed in joy. After sending the waiter away, Zhou Xuanji walked to the table and poured tea as he said, when I go to fight, you stay here. No matter what happens, don't come over. Little Jiang Shui heard him and immediately became anxious. Will you be in danger? Zhou Xuanji passed the teacup to her and said with a smile, not really. I just don't want to expose our identities. I will go from another direction. Having heard him, little Jiang Shui was relieved. Before she met Northern Sword Valiant, she was very disdainful of him. But when she passed by the training field, Northern Sword Valiant's temperament made her feel that he was not someone to be trifled with, so she was a little worried. "When are you going?" little Jiang Shui asked. Zhou Xuanji muttered, "In 2 days. I will go out and make some arrangements." "What arrangements?" little Jiang Shui asked curiously. Zhou Xuanji did not hide anything. He prepared to find someone to spread the news that Sword God Zhou would accept the challenge in 2 days. Since Northern Sword Valiant wanted to embarrass him, he would take this opportunity to make a name for himself. Little Jiang Shui heard him and sighed in amazement. "Xuanji, at such a young age, how can you be so scheming?" Zhou Xuanji rolled his eyes. "Scheming? It's obviously strategizing." After resting for a while, Zhou Xuanji left the inn. He found some beggars and children and tempted them with silver to spread the news. Before night fell, the news about Sword God Zhou accepting the challenge had already spread throughout the city. After returning to the inn, Zhou Xuanji did not cultivate but began eating delicacies with little Jiang Shui. It must be said that the mutton hot pot in this inn was really fragrant. It was fatty but not greasy, and it was extremely springy. When chewed, the deliciousness lingered in the mouth. Compared to roasted game, it was perfect. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, the two of them lay on the bed and began chatting. They talked about the future. As little Jiang Shui grew older, her ideas became more ambitious. Zhou Xuanji could not help but sigh. This girl had really entered puberty. Just when Zhou Xuanji was about to fall asleep, little Jiang Shui suddenly poked his waist with her hand and said softly, "Xuanji, I feel like I'm sick. I might have internal injuries from training." Zhou Xuanji heard her and immediately became anxious. He turned over and asked, "What's wrong? Does your body hurt?" Little Jiang Shui blushed and said softly, "Recently, when I peed, it was all blood." Zhou Xuanji was stunned, and his expression became awkward. Damn, internal injuries? He thought about it and realized that it was true. Little Jiang Shui had been with him since she was 6 years old. She did not have any adult women to teach her, so she did not know much about physiology. Chapter 37. 2 days later. Cloud Swallow City, Central Training Field. Northern Sword Valiant was still standing on the sword, but this time his eyes were open. The martial arts practice field was surrounded by circles of people. There were at least 1,000 people. "I heard that Sword God Zhou is accepting the challenge today." "Yeah, the news has already spread all over the city." "Tisk tsk. Who do you think is stronger between Sword God Zhou and Northern Sword Valiant?" "Beixiao Wangjian should be stronger. After all, he has been famous for a long time." The bandits that Sword God Zhou defeated were all at the foundation building stage. "They are not really powerful," the people discussed among themselves. Even though most of them were criticizing Sword God Zhou, they were still waiting here, anticipating Sword God Zhou's arrival. Xiao Qingfeng, Miss Jishui, and Zhang Ruyu were among the crowd. In addition, Old Qing and the purple-robed man were also standing in front of the window, looking at the arena. "Young master, have you seen Princess Xuanya?" Old Qing asked curiously. Today's battle was going to be the most sensational event in Cloud Swallow City. The mischievous and lively Princess Xuanya would most likely come. The purple-robed man shook his head and said, "Not yet." Meanwhile, among the crowd, a skinny young man in tattered gray clothes was squeezing his way forward. "Excuse me. Excuse me." The young man shouted as he squeezed. Even though his face was dirty, his facial features were exquisite, and his eyes were bright, exuding a sense of elegance. Soon, he squeezed to the front and looked excitedly at Northern Sword Valiant on the training field. He looked around and wanted to see if Sword God Zhou was already here. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of Xiao Qingfeng and Lady Jishui. He shrank his neck in fear and quickly turned his head. The corner of his mouth twitched as he said in a low voice, "Why are those two here?" One was a lackey of the Empress while the other was a maid of consort Qin. Could it be that they had an affair? Thinking of this, he rolled his eyes and became excited again. He began to steal glances at Xiao Qingfeng and Lady Zhishui. On the stage, Northern Sword Valiant frowned. It was already noon. Why was Sword God Zhou not here yet? He did not challenge Sword God Zhou for fame, nor was it because of hatred. However, he heard that Sword God Zhou was proficient in the will of the sword and could kill all his enemies in an instant, so he could not help but want to challenge him. The sword Dao he pursued was battle. Continuously defeating the experts of the sword Dao, and finally reaching the peak of the sword Dao. However, he did not really treat Sword God Zhou as his opponent, which was why he was not in a hurry. In his eyes, Sword God Zhou was no match for him. Even if he didn't come, it was reasonable. However, 2 days ago, the news of Sword God Zhou's arrival suddenly spread, which made him interested in Sword God Zhou again. No matter if you are Sword God Zhou or Sword God Li, under my sovereign sword, you will never dare to hold a sword again. Northern Sword Valiant thought confidently. A figure flashed across his mind. That person was his main target. Sword Monarch Xiao Jinghong. He couldn't help but grit his teeth when he recalled the battle several years ago where he was defeated by Xiao Jinghong. His expression was noticed by the people outside, and they thought he was impatient. Does Sword God Zhou dare to come? Suddenly, a dissatisfied shout came from the crowd. It was very difficult to find the owner of the voice. Zhang Ruyu heard him and became furious. If Sword God Zhou says he will come, he will definitely come. He's the strongest. The people around him turned around and looked at him strangely. Isn't this Zhang Tianjian's son? Didn't Zhang Tianjian have some complaints about Sword God Zhou? Could it be that there was a traitor in the Zhang family? Zhang Ruyu did not care about the opinions of the people around him. He worshipped Sword God Zhou, and he wanted to express it loudly. Swoosh! At this moment, an ear-piercing sound came, which tore apart the clamor around the training ground. A thin sword flew past the pavilions and landed 5 meters in front of Northern Sword Valiant. The blade pierced into the hard ground, and the body of the sword vibrated continuously. Windcutter sword. Seeing this sword, Northern Sword Valiant squinted his eyes and thought to himself, it's a good sword. The entire place was silent. Thousands of people turned around to look, like a wave of people. They saw a small silhouette flying over on a sword. He was about 1.3 meters tall, wearing a black shirt with golden threads and a silver mask. His hands were placed behind his waist, and he stood on a silver-black domineering long sword. It was Zhou Xuanji. With the Hell King sword support, he quickly came to the training ground and looked down at Northern Sword Valiant. Sword God Zhou is here. Zhang Ruyu shouted excitedly. Even though Zhou Xuanji was wearing a mask, he could recognize him at first glance. That proud and aloof swordsman, who else could it be other than Sword God Zhou? Zhang Ruyu's excitement spurred on the others. But the others did not want to see Sword God Zhou show off his might. They were just here to watch the show. He is Sword God Zhou. He looks like a kid. What do you know? He has regained his youth. He is wearing a mask. It seems like he is afraid of making a fool of himself. His sword looks impressive. I wonder what grade it is. Such a pretentious entrance. How embarrassing would it be when he kneels down and begs for mercy later? The spectators chatted among themselves, and all eyes were locked on Zhou Xuanji. The man in purple shook his head and said, challenging enlightening level 3 with the cultivation of foundation building level 6 is really seeking death. Even though Zhou Xuanji used the chi obscuring incantation, he could still see through his cultivation. Old Qing chuckled, there are so many hotheads in this world. Other than them, Xiao Qingfeng and Ms. Jishui shook their heads too. Xiao Qingfeng laughed at himself, seems like I thought too much. He thought it would be an exciting battle. What a waste of time. Northern Sword Valiant also saw through Zhou Xuanji's cultivation. He frowned and said, you don't know that I have already reached enlightening stage? Qi nurturing, foundation building, enlightening, inner pellet, soul fountain, astral infant, astral projection, spirit refinement, great realization. The difference between each stage was almost insurmountable. Zhou Xuanji stared at him and said, "The powerful do not need to understand the weak." Northern Sword Valiant frowned. Is there something wrong with this guy's brain? The spectators outside the arena looked at each other in dismay. The handsome young man blinked his eyes and looked at Zhou Xuanji curiously. This guy is so arrogant. Zhang Riyu's eyes were beaming. Sword God Zhou indeed. He's really the leader of our generation. The man in purple shook his head and laughed. This guy is interesting. The word interesting in his mouth was, of course, a derogatory term. Humph. Northern Sword Valiant snorted coldly. He was arrogant to begin with. How could he tolerate someone else's insult? He immediately leaped up, and the sword under his feet was pulled up from the ground. He turned around and slashed at Zhou Xuanji with the momentum. His speed was very fast. The entire set of movements took less than a second. Zhou Xuanji used the 8-step sword lunge and came to the back of Northern Sword Valiant. He raised his right hand, and the Hell King's sword flew into his hand. Northern Sword Valiant landed on the ground and turned around. What movement technique are you using? He asked in astonishment. Swoosh, pft. A cold light flashed. Northern Sword Valiant tilted his head instinctively, but his cheek was still cut by the Wind Cutter sword. Blood spurted out. The Wind Cutter sword was stabbed into the training ground and was ignored by Northern Sword Valiant, so he suffered a small loss. Chapter 38. The thousands of people were stunned. They did not expect Northern Sword Valiant to be the first to be injured. Could it be that Sword God Zhou was really powerful? Brat, you dare to plot against me. Die. Northern Sword Valiant was furious and shouted with a deep voice. His words made the spectators realize the truth. That's right. It was only a plot. Northern Sword Valiant charged at Zhou Xuanji with his sword. This time, he was serious. Zhou Xuanji held the Hell King's sword in his right hand and the Wind Cutter sword in his left. Facing Northern Sword Valiant, he did not retreat but advanced instead. Facing an enlightening cultivator, Zhou Xuanji did not dare to be careless. He activated the White Crane's sword will with his right hand and the Fiery sword will with his left. With the dual sword wills in his body, his entire chi became erratic. At the same moment, the man in purple opened his eyes wide and breathed rapidly. Xiao Qingfeng and Ms. Jishui were stunned too. Northern Sword Valiant was shocked by Zhou Xuanji's dual sword wills and stepped back instinctively. He had already understood sword wills and was extremely sensitive to them. Using 2 sword wills at the same time? How can it be? Even the Sword Monarch of Great Zhou and the Sword Noble could not do it. Northern Sword Valiant thought in shock. He immediately activated his own sword will. His entire temperament changed, and gusts of strong wind appeared around his body. Zhou Xuanji moved behind Northern Sword Valiant with the 8-step sword lunge and slashed with his swords with both hands. The speed of his swing surpassed the foundation building stage. Most of the spectators could not follow it with their eyes. Clang! Clang! Ding! Clang! Zhou Xuanji's swords moved like the wind. Northern Sword Valiant's sword was extremely fast as well. The 3 swords slashed at each other at high speed, and the shadows of the swords glinted coldly. The 2 of them fought back and forth, but they were evenly matched. Half of Zhou Xuanji's body was wrapped in flames. His body was like a white crane, agile and swift. Northern Sword Valiant's sword was powerful and heavy. The sword in his hand seemed to be wrapped in a layer of red light. Within a radius of 100 meters, a strong gust of wind surrounded the 2 of them. The 1,000 spectators were dumbfounded. Sword God Zhou and Northern Sword Valiant were evenly matched. The entire place was silent. Little Jiang Shui was watching nervously by the window of the guest room. She covered her chest with both hands and mumbled, "Xuanji. You will win. You will win, in another inn." The purple-robed man rubbed his chin and mumbled, "This kid's talent in the sword Dao is really rare. I can use him." Old Qing stared at Zhou Xuanji and nodded, using 2 sword wills at the same time. Impressive indeed. On the other side, Xiao Qingfeng clenched his fists and stared at Zhou Xuanji, as though he saw something unbelievable. The delicate youth's mouth was agape, and a look of shock appeared on his face. Only the sound of swords clashing could be heard. A rooster's voice was heard, "All hail sword god Zhou. Kill him." The voice belonged to Zhang Ruyu. Due to his agitation, his voice cracked. Zhou Xuanji sensed that Northern Valiant Sword was getting used to his dual sword wills, and he knew that something was wrong. Unlike the previous battle with Xiao Jinghong, Northern Sword Valiant used his cultivation. The difference in their realms was enough to make up for the lack of sword will. Looks like I have to end this quickly. Zhou Xuanji made up his mind. He used the 8-step sword lunge again and moved behind Beixiao Wangjian. Northern Sword Valiant smiled in disdain. With a backhand slash, he slashed at the air. Zhou Xuanji was 10 meters away from him and did not attack. "Why? Are you afraid?" Northern Sword Valiant asked with a cold smile. As he spoke, he shook his right hand, and the sword fell, creating a small pit beside his feet. Zhou Xuanji stored the Wind Cutter sword into the supreme storage and deactivated the dual sword wills. He said, "I've played enough. Next, I will defeat you with one slash." With this, the entire place was in an uproar. One slash? The people suddenly remembered the stories of sword god Zhou. He killed his enemies with one slash. If it was before, they might have thought that sword god Zhou was boasting. But after witnessing the battle between sword god Zhou and Northern Sword Valiant, they began to believe that sword god Zhou was really powerful. Northern Sword Valiant was stunned, and then he burst out in laughter. It was as though he had heard the funniest joke in the world. He raised his sword and pointed it at Zhou Xuanji, saying, "You want to defeat me with one slash? You don't have." Ta! Zhou Xuanji came up to him with one step. The Hell King's sword in his hand shot out countless sword shadows. In an instant, Northern Sword Valiant felt a horrifying pressure locking onto him. Coupled with Zhou Xuanji's swift movements, he could not react in time. Trisource Vein Severing Sword. Sword Will. A gold-grade legendary sword exploded with horrifying destructive power. PFFTTT Northern Sword Valiant was covered in blood. His eyes were wide open and filled with disbelief. He looked at Zhou Xuanji, who was in front of him, as though he was looking at a devil. How can it be? This isn't the Sword Noble's Trisource Vein Severing Sword. It's also Sword Will. Northern Sword Valiant was extremely shocked. All the vital channels in his body were severed. His spirit energy dissipated, and his legs bent. Thump. The dignified Northern Sword Valiant knelt down in front of Zhou Xuanji. Virum, the buzzing sound of the blade resounded in Northern Sword Valiant's ears. It was deafening. He saw the Hell King's sword land on his neck. Zhou Xuanji raised his chin and looked at Northern Sword Valiant with disdain. "You lost," he said. He was pleasantly surprised in his heart. Gold-grade legendary swords are so powerful. When he used the Trisource Vein Severing Sword just now, he felt that his sword chi was more than 10 times stronger. He felt that he could dominate the world with just one slash. Silence. The entire place was so silent that even a pin drop could be heard. Everyone looked at Zhou Xuanji, tongue-tied. It was really just one slash, and the energetic Northern Sword Valiant knelt down. Such prowess. Zhang Ruyu was so excited that his face and neck were red. He shouted at the top of his lungs, "All hail Sword God Zhou." As expected of the Sword God, Northern Sword Valiant was a powerful cultivator at the enlightening stage. He understood the sword will himself. Before he could show his prowess, he was defeated by Zhou Xuanji in an instant. At this moment, Zhang Ryu wanted to kneel down in front of Zhou Xuanji. If there were not so many people around, he would have already knelt down and worshipped him. The entire place was in an uproar. Thousands of people cheered Sword God Zhou's name in excitement. Sword God Zhou. Sword God Zhou. Too powerful. He really is a sword god. What happened just now? Did you guys see it clearly? Such a domineering slash. Our empire's Zhang Tianjian could slash like that? The moment he swung his sword, I could feel the aura of death even from so far away. The doubts and mockery from before disappeared in an instant. The powerful ones were respected. That slash just now, Xiao Qingfeng squinted his eyes and mumbled to himself. He was thinking, if it was him, could he dodge it? His cultivation was higher than Northern Sword Valiant, but he was also amazed by Zhou Xuanji's slash just now. But he was more observant, and he felt that Zhou Xuanji's Hell King's sword was not as simple as it seemed. How could Zhou Xuanji, who was only at foundation building level 6, have such a powerful sword chi? It's a good sword. The man in purple stared at the Hell King's sword in Zhou Xuanji's hand and was in deep thought. On the other side, little Jiang Shui was jumping up and down in her room. She looked very excited. Zhou Xuanji slowly sheathed his sword and prepared to leave. Northern Sword Valiant gritted his teeth and asked with difficulty, "Who are you?" What was that slash just now? Zhou Xuanji stopped with his back facing him. He lowered his head and smiled. The sword begets one, the sword begets three, the sword begets all things. The man is the sword is the man. The man and the sword become one, unparalleled in the world. Chapter 39. The sword gives birth to all things. Man is the sword is man, one with the sword. Unparalleled in the world, Northern Sword Valiant seemed to have fallen into a demonic spell, his mouth muttering incessantly. Zhou Xuanji managed to bluff him with a few words. Because Zhou Xuanji's slash was just too powerful. As a result, Zhou Xuanji's image in his heart quickly rose. Seeing that Zhou Xuanji was about to leave, Northern Valiant Sword came back to his senses. He hurriedly shouted, "Master!" Whoosh, the 1,000 spectators were in an uproar. Northern Sword Valiant was really going to become Sword God Zhou's disciple? Zhou Xuanji stopped and said, "I already have a disciple." Beixiao Wangjian was stunned. He was not surprised that Zhou Xuanji had a disciple. But Zhou Xuanji used this excuse to evade it. Could it be that the disciple was more powerful than him? He subconsciously asked, "Who is he?" Zhou Xuanji said without looking back, "The next person to use dual sword wills is my disciple." After he finished speaking, he leaped up and flew towards the horizon on the Hell King's sword. Beixiao Wangjian knelt on the training field and fell into a trance. The next person with dual sword wills, the people around the training ground began to discuss excitedly. No one cared about the severely injured Northern Sword Valiant. They were all talking about how powerful Sword God Zhou was. What a good sword begets all things. Sword God Zhou is really a grandmaster in the way of the sword. He might become someone like the sword monarch of Great Zhou in the future. Impossible. If the sword monarch of Great Zhou fought against Northern Sword Valiant, it would definitely be an instant kill. Didn't Sword God Zhou defeat Northern Valiant Sword with one move? If it wasn't for Sword God Zhou's unparalleled benevolence, not killing those without a grudge, this day next year would be Northern Valiant Sword's death anniversary. Nonsense, Sword God or Sword Emperor, who do you think is stronger? I'll just chuckle. You guys don't know how high the Sword Monarch of Great Zhou stands, so don't talk nonsense. When people were discussing Sword God Zhou's prowess, they actually dragged the Sword Monarch into it. Those who were not weak knew that Sword God Zhou was not as powerful as the Sword Monarch of Great Zhou, but there were too many weak people around. The man in purple looked at Zhou Xuanji's back and instructed, "Chase after him and tell him what I want." Yes. Old Xing nodded, turned into a wisp of green smoke, and disappeared from the room. In the crowd, Zhang Ruyu grabbed the collar of a man next to him and roared, "Did you see that? I already said that sword god Zhou is stronger. You don't believe me." That person's face turned red from his grip, and he almost fainted from suffocation. On the other side, Xiao Qingfeng took a deep breath and said to Lady Zhishui, "I have something to do, so I have to go." 7 days later, at noon, we will meet at the north gate of the Cloud Swallow City and return to the Zhou dynasty together. With that, he squeezed through the crowd and left. Lady Zhishui looked deeply at his back and mumbled, "Trying to rope in sword god Zhou? Xiao Qingfeng, are you loyal to Her Majesty the Empress, or do you have ulterior motives?" Dozens of meters away, the delicate youth also quietly left. However, he did not notice that a pair of eyes had landed on him. It was the purple-clothed man who was standing on the roof in the distance. Once Old Qing left, he went to the top of the building to search for Princess Xuanya. Soon, he found it. A look of greed appeared on his face as he looked at the handsome youth, and he murmured, "The aura of the Tao embodiment body is truly delicious." On the training field, Northern Sword Valiant, who was at a loss, looked determined. He muttered to himself, "Sword god Zhou, I must become your disciple." He saw a glimmer of hope in Sword god Zhou. Maybe he could learn from Sword god Zhou the ability to defeat the Sword Noble. In a small alley, Zhou Xuanji suddenly stopped. "Who is it?" he asked with a deep voice. A wisp of green smoke floated into the alley and turned into Old Qing's figure. Old Qing chuckled, "Sword god Zhou, that move just now was indeed impressive. But you relied more on the sword in your hand, right?" Zhou Xuanji turned around and looked at him. "What are you trying to say?" He could sense that Old Qing was very dangerous, much more powerful than Northern Sword Valiant. Old Qing stroked his long beard and smiled. "Have you heard of the Gulan Demon Monarch? My young master is the son of the Gulan Demon Monarch. He wants to invite you to join him." Gulan Demon Monarch. Zhou Xuanji's pupils contracted suddenly. How could he not know about the Gulan Demon Monarch? He was a powerful being that gave the great Zhou Empire headaches. Even the son of the Gulan Demon Monarch was far more powerful than the inner pellet stage. He could not deal with him. But as a human, how could he join the demon race? Zhou Xuanji squinted his eyes. "What if I refuse?" At this moment, a shrill scream came from afar. Even in broad daylight, it made one's scalp numb. Next, a series of screams came from all directions. Zhou Xuanji frowned under his mask. Could the demon race have invaded Cloud Swallow City? He became anxious immediately, not for himself, but for little Jiang Shui. Old Qing smiled. "If you refuse, don't even think about leaving Cloud Swallow City alive. Soon, this city will become a city of corpses. Do you want to become one of them?" Zhou Xuanji said, "Okay, I promise you. But can I bring one person with me?" Old Qing nodded. "Not just one, even 2 are fine, but not 3. What's wrong with him?" Zhou Xuanji complained in his heart, but he did not dare to say it out loud. Shortly after, under Old Qing's lead, he went to meet the son of the Gulan Demon Monarch. The young master's name is Zhuang Huisheng. You can call him young master from now on. Old Qing reminded him as he led the way. Zhou Xuanji nodded. He was not interested in this. His thoughts were already on little Jiang Shui. He prayed in his heart that she would not run out and wait for him in the inn. Soon, they passed by the training field. At this moment, there were many corpses lying around the training field. Blood stained the street. Northern Sword Valiant was still kneeling on the training field. His vital channels were severed and he could not move at all. He glanced at Zhou Xuanji with his eyes. When he saw Zhou Xuanji and Old Qing walking together, he was in disbelief. The man in purple, whose name was Zhuang Huisheng, stood on the roof of the inn he stayed in. He grabbed the handsome young man in his hand. The handsome young man seemed to be immobilized. He could not move at all, and his eyes were filled with fear. You are here. You know what's good for you. Don't worry, I will not mistreat you. Zhuang Huixing smiled satisfactorily. Sword God Zhou might not be very powerful at the moment, but he was talented. With proper training, he would become his right-hand man in the future. Zhou Xuanji did not reply. He looked left and right. There were many collapsed buildings around him, and the inn he stayed in was on the other side of the training field. He could not see what was happening there. After he thought about it, he leaped up and came to the top of a building. He looked ahead, and his expression changed immediately. The inn they stayed in had already collapsed. He immediately flew over on his sword and came to the ruins. He began to sense little Jiang Shui's qi. Xuanji, a weak voice came from the ruins. Zhou Xuanji immediately flipped over the wooden pillars. Soon, he saw little Jiang Shui. Her face was covered in dirt and she was crushed under the roof beam. Not far away, there were other people's broken limbs. It was extremely horrifying. If little Jiang Shui was not at foundation building, she would have been crushed to death. Zhou Xuanji clenched his fists in his sleeves. He quickly rescued little Jiang Shui. Zhuang Huixing brought the handsome young man and old Qing to the edge of the training field. They were dozens of meters away from Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui. He raised his brow and asked, "She's just a little girl. What does she have to do with you?" Zhou Xuanji let little Jiang Shui lie on the ruins. He did not reply to Zhuang Huixing but examined her. He found that her right leg was fractured and swollen to an exaggerated degree. He immediately took out bottles of pills and placed them in little Jiang Shui's hands. "Sister, don't be afraid. I will avenge you," he said softly. After he finished speaking, he got up slowly. The Hell King's sword appeared in his hand. His right hand gripped the Hell King's sword tightly and trembled slightly. He turned around to look at Zhuang Huixing and roared furiously, "Zhuang Huixing! I will **ck your mother." Chapter 40. Hearing Zhou Xuanji's cursing, Zhuang Huixing's expression darkened immediately. His eyes were filled with murderous intent. Old Qing was even more furious. His body grew taller and his muscles bulged. His robe was on the verge of bursting. He stared at Zhou Xuanji and said, "How dare you? How dare you insult the young lord like this? Do you want to die?" Even though Sword God Zhou had great talent, what was the point of raising a disobedient dog? "Xuanji, be careful," little Jiang Shui reminded. She had witnessed Zhuang Huixing's attack with her own eyes. He was like a demon. To her, Zhou Xuanji was far from being Zhuang Huixing's enemy. But she chose to believe in Zhou Xuanji. Her brother always worked miracles. Under the silver mask, Zhou Xuanji's eyes were filled with fury and murderous intent. In this world, little Jiang Shui was the most important person to him. He had never scolded little Jiang Shui, let alone hit her. Seeing little Jiang Shui injured made him feel even worse than if he was injured himself. At this moment, he had forgotten his fear of the Gulan demon monarch. Even if he was no match for Zhuang Huixing, he still had to make a move. No matter who it was, if they dared to hurt little Jiang Shui, he would fight with his life. He raised his sword and walked towards Zhuang Huixing. The blade of the sword slid on the ground and made a piercing sound. Zhuang Huixing frowned. He did not expect Zhou Xuanji to fall out with him because of a little girl. Could this girl be Sword God Zhou's daughter? He thought of many possibilities, but he still felt unhappy. His desire to cherish talents and his anger made him fall into a dilemma. At this moment, old Qing walked toward Zhou Xuanji. "Stinking brat, I gave you a chance but you didn't want it. Since that's the case, I'll send you to hell." Old Qing's face became hideous and terrifying. The appearance of an old demon was revealed, and two sharp fangs grew out of his mouth. On the training ground, Northern Sword Valiant looked at Zhou Xuanji and wanted to speak, but he no longer had the energy to. He knew how powerful Zhuang Huixing was. Zhou Xuanji might not stand a chance against him. So what if he defeated Zhuang Huixing? After offending the Gulan demon monarch, death was inevitable unless they hid in the great Zhou dynasty's imperial city. The handsome young man who was immobilized beside Zhuang Huixing also stared at Zhou Xuanji. He thought back to Zhou Xuanji's powerful performance, and a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. Not all the people lying around the martial arts arena were dead. There were many people who were still alive. Some were crushed under the rubble, and some were lying on the street. At this moment, they all placed their hopes on Zhou Xuanji. Old Qing and Zhou Xuanji were getting closer and closer. Zhou Xuanji fixed his gaze on Zhuang Huixing and ignored Old Qing. Sword God Zhou. Defeat him, a weak voice came from under the collapsed beam. Thud. Zhou Xuanji immediately stepped out with his right foot, which cracked the stone under his feet. He leaped toward Zhuang Huixing. Old Qing suddenly raised his right hand. His palm turned into a beast claw and rapidly enlarged. It was completely out of proportion to his body size. It was like a massive fan slamming toward Zhou Xuanji. This palm strike was so powerful that it could shatter a small mountain. Just when Zhou Xuanji was about to be hit, he suddenly appeared behind Old Qing with the 8-step sword lunge. Bang! Old Qing's palm strike missed and landed on the ground, causing it to crumble. Cracks extended forward like a spider web. Before he could turn around, Zhou Xuanji activated the 8-step sword lunge again and moved swiftly toward Zhuang Huixing. Gripping the Hell King's sword in his hand, he immediately entered the Trisource vein, severing sword in tense state. Human heart into sword. He became one with the Hell King's sword. Even so, in his eyes, Zhuang Huixing was flawless. He pierced his sword toward Zhuang Huixing. A cold gleam flashed, and the handsome young man closed his eyes. Humph! Zhuang Huixing snorted with disdain. His left palm was as fast as lightning. With a slap, a surge of demonic energy flowed from his palm. Boom! Zhou Xuanji could only feel a strong gust of wind coming toward him. His qi and blood were in a mess, and a mouthful of blood flowed up his throat. His body flew backward like a kite with a broken string. He flew over Old Qing's head and landed beside little Jiang Shui after flying dozens of meters. Xuanji! Little Jiang Shui cried out in surprise. She quickly supported herself with her hands and tried to stand up. At this moment, Zhou Xuanji jumped up like a carp. He swallowed the blood in his throat but did not spit it out. He still looked at Zhuang Huixing fiercely. Zhuang Huixing looked at him coldly and said, "Sword God Zhou, even if you are talented in the way of the sword and have the help of a high-grade enchanted artifact, you are still only at foundation building level 6. It is impossible for you to defeat me. Kneel down now, kowtow to me, and admit your mistakes. I can spare both of your lives." If it were someone else, he would have killed him with a slap. But Zhou Xuanji's talent in the way of the sword was too outstanding. He could not bear to kill him. Zhou Xuanji raised his hand and motioned for little Jiang Shui to stay away. He lowered his head and said softly, "Recuperate first. Leave the killing to me." Old Qing heard him and stomped his feet in anger. He said to Zhuang Huixing, "Young master, this brat is completely crazy. He even wants to kill you. Let me eat him." 100 meters away, at the entrance of the alley, Xiao Qingfeng tilted his head to observe the battle. He frowned. He did not expect Zhuang Huixing to appear in Cloud Swallow City. This time, Cloud Swallow City will face a catastrophe. Seeing that Zhou Xuanji wanted to challenge Zhuang Huixing, he cursed in his heart. What a brute! He still wanted to rope Zhou Xuanji in, so he did not want him to die here. On the other side of the training ground, Zhang Ruyu hid behind a huge tree that was snapped in half. He looked ahead anxiously and mumbled to himself, "Why is father not here yet?" Cloud Swallow City was invaded by the demon young master. It was a great humiliation to the southern Snow Kingdom. But recently, Zhang Tianjian had been guarding against Gulan Demon Monarch. He should be here soon. He hoped that sword god Zhou could hold on until his father arrived. At this moment, they were not the only ones staring at Zhou Xuanji. The injured civilians and cultivators were also looking at him. Those who stayed nearby were all severely injured and could not move. Seeing that Zhou Xuanji was no match for Zhuang Huisheng, they fell into despair. Damn! So painful, Zhou Xuanji twisted his neck and endured the pain all over his body to stand up straight. That slap just now broke a few of his ribs. His internal organs were in discomfort, as though they were in an uproar. Zhuang Huisheng frowned and said, "Forget it. Kill him." Cloud Swallow City was already in chaos. The news would soon reach the capital of the Southern Snow Kingdom. He had to leave with Princess Xuanya as soon as possible. Since this genius in the sword's way was not willing to submit to him, then he would kill him here. Okay. Old Qing grinned coldly. His face was hideous, and the evil look of a demon sent chills down people's spines. He immediately walked toward Zhou Xuanji. As he walked, he licked his lips and said coldly, "You are so talented, your flesh must be delicious." Zhou Xuanji took a deep breath. He held the Hell King's sword in a reverse grip with his right hand and placed the blade in front of him. A horrifying aura exploded from his body. Strands of black qi seeped out from the surface of his body and gradually formed the shadow of the Hell King, which attached itself to his body. Old Qing stopped and was slightly moved. "Old bastard, you want to eat me? Ask the sword in my hand first." Zhou Xuanji squinted his eyes and said coldly. Under the cold reflection of the blade, his eyes were extremely sharp. Chapter 41. Although the Nether King's phantom was blurry, it was filled with a terrifying baleful aura. Old Qing was frightened by the Netherworld King, so he asked, "Kid, what is this?" Zhuang Huisheng looked at Zhou Xuanji in astonishment. At this moment, he could not see through Zhou Xuanji. The delicate youth's eyes widened in shock. Zhang Ruyu and Xiao Qingfeng, who were hiding in the dark, were also stunned. Those who were heavily injured all looked at Zhou Xuanji in a daze. Seeing Zhou Xuanji's aura, could it be that today's crisis had turned for the better? It was not her first time seeing Zhou Xuanji being possessed by the Hell King, but she was not sure if he could defeat Old Qing and Zhuang Huisheng after being possessed by the Hell King. She didn't dare to make another sound and could only endure the pain to heal herself. After entering Hell King possession, Zhou Xuanji's confidence was greatly boosted. The corners of his mouth curled up. Beneath the silver mask, his eyes became crazed and conceited. Old Qing's heart trembled when he met his gaze. What kind of secret technique did this kid use? Just when he was about to continue asking, Zhou Xuanji suddenly used the 8-step sword lunge and rushed in front of him. The sword light appeared. Old Qing's pupils suddenly dilated. In his eyes, countless black sword auras rushed towards him. Puchi. Zhou Xuanji stopped behind Old Qing. His sword qi swept out, and the surrounding houses and ruins were reduced into countless wood shavings and gravel. Dust billowed into the air. Old Qing's entire body was covered in blood, and the blood splattered on the ground. This scene left everyone dumbfounded. Even Zhuang Huisheng widened his eyes and exclaimed, "How is this possible?" Zhou Xuanji was only at foundation building level 6. How could he injure Old Qing, who was at 4th rank level 9? The cultivation of the demon race was not as varied as that of the human race. It was directly divided into 9 levels. Each level corresponded to a great realm of human cultivation. Rank 4 Stage 9 was equivalent to Inner Pellet Stage 9. Crossing 2 realms to kill the enemy? Wait a minute. That sword. It was definitely an evil sword. Zhuang Huisheng stared at the Hell King's sword in Zhou Xuanji's hand. There were countless weapons in the world, but some of them could be possessed by spirits. They could be gods, celestial spirits, or even evil spirits. The evil spirit temporarily boosted Zhou Xuanji's cultivation, which was why he had such power. Old Qing slowly knelt down. His body trembled and actually turned into a large squirrel. His body was covered in blood as he collapsed on the ground, his limbs twitching. Impossible. What sword is that? Impossible, Old Qing muttered in a trembling voice. His voice gradually became softer and softer, and in the end, there was no sound. He breathed his last and breathed his last. On the martial arts practice field. Northern Sword Valiant's eyes widened and his body trembled as if he had just seen a peerless sword technique. This sword. This is the sword that I pursue. The sword gives birth to all things. Unparalleled in the world, he forgot about the pain and fell into an unprecedented joy. He would never forget that strike just now. Zhou Xuanji walked toward Zhuang Huixing with his sword in hand. The tip of the sword scraped the ground and made an ear-piercing sound. He stared at Zhuang Huixing and coldly said, "You dare to hurt her. I will make you pay." Zhuang Huixing did not lose his mind because of Old Qing's death. Instead, he frowned and shouted, "Aren't you afraid that you will go mad and fall into the demonic path by using such an evil sword?" Zhou Xuanji said, "Even if I become a demon, I will kill you." The childish voice seemed to have come from the depths of hell, filled with extreme killing intent. Boom! He stomped on the ground with his right foot, leaving a deep footprint. He leaped up with the Hell King's sword in his right hand and pierced toward Zhuang Huixing. Trisource veins severing sword will. At this moment, in his eyes, Zhuang Huixing's weakness was revealed. Facing the aggressive Zhou Xuanji, Zhuang Huixing did not panic but swung his palm. His demonic energy transformed into a giant white tiger that roared out from his palm. Its might shook the entire city. Zhou Xuanji's sword pierced through the giant white tiger and pointed straight at Zhuang Huixing's forehead. Zhuang Huixing opened his eyes wide in disbelief. But he was not hit. He grabbed the handsome young man and leaped backward, dodging the strike. Bomb! The ground beneath his feet caved in from the impact of the sword qi. Pebbles flew in all directions. Zhou Xuanji's eyes were like the gleam of a sword. He leaped up the moment he landed and chased after Zhuang Huixing. Zhuang Huixing was furious. This guy really wanted to kill him. His left hand suddenly turned into a tiger's claw and swung toward Zhou Xuanji. Streams of visible energy swept toward Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji quickly swung the Hell King's sword and dispersed the demonic qi. The swine-culling sword appeared under his feet suddenly. Standing on the swine-culling sword, he used the 8-step sword lunge and charged toward Zhuang Huixing. Clang! The Hell King's sword clashed with Zhuang Huixing's tiger claw, creating sparks. The blade cut into his skin and hair, and blood splattered. Zhuang Huixing's face contorted in pain. The handsome young man in his hand opened his eyes wide and stared at Zhou Xuanji, who was right in front of him. His eyes were cold and sharp, with absolute arrogance, as though there was nothing in the world that he could not cut. He was also a little crazy, as though he wanted to tear Zhuang Huixing into pieces. The handsome young man was mesmerized. Zhou Xuanji raised his left hand, and the crimson dragon's sword appeared in his hand. A dragon roar exploded, and he slashed at Zhuang Huixing. Zhuang Huixing was so frightened that he retreated quickly again. Although the crimson dragon's sword missed its target, a crimson dragon's soul charged out with a roar. It grew larger quickly and attempted to swallow Zhuang Huixing. Zhuang Huixing's face suddenly turned into that of a white tiger. He roared furiously, and the sound wave became tangible, which shook the crimson dragon's soul and reduced its speed. Zhou Xuanji suddenly appeared above his head. His body spun, and the Hell King's sword and crimson dragon's sword swept up a strong gale, like a tornado toward Zhuang Huixing. Damn! Do you really think I'm easy to bully? Zhuang Huixing was completely enraged. His eyes turned brown, and 2 beams of white light shot out, sending Zhou Xuanji flying away. But before Zhou Xuanji landed on the ground, the swine-culling sword flew up. He stepped on it and leaped up, charging toward Zhuang Huixing. Seeing that Zhou Xuanji and Zhuang Huisheng were exchanging blows, Northern Valiant Sword trembled in excitement. The injured who were lying on the ground saw hope too. Do your best, Sword God Zhou, kill this devil. I beg of you. So powerful. He really is a sword god, you must win, why are the reinforcements not here yet? They tried their best to cheer for Zhou Xuanji, but he could no longer hear them. He only had eyes for Zhuang Huisheng. The more he looked at Zhuang Huisheng, the angrier he became. An indescribable violence filled his heart. He must tear Zhuang Huisheng into pieces. Far away, little Jiang Shui fixed her bones with her spirit energy while looking at Zhou Xuanji anxiously. Zhou Xuanji, who was possessed by the Hell King, looked like a demon, but in her eyes, he was still her pillar of support. So powerful. Zhuang Huisheng is at 4th rank level 10. With his talent in his bloodline, he is almost invincible among the 4th rank cultivators, Shao Qingfeng mumbled to himself. At this moment, he was a little hesitant. Could he really rope in such a sword god Zhou? Clang! 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 Zhou Xuanji's swords moved faster and faster, and his strength increased as well. He slashed and slashed at Zhuang Huisheng like a mad demon. It looked like a mess, but he did not dispel the trisource vein severing sword will. Every slash that injured Zhuang Huisheng would definitely destroy his meridians. How can it be? What kind of evil spell is this? Zhuang Huisheng thought in horror as he defended himself. If this continued, things would not be good. Chapter 42. Seeing that the situation was not in his favor, Zhuang Huisheng immediately had the intention to retreat. He carried the handsome young man and turned to escape. Zhou Xuanji's 2 swords slashed through thin air again. He leaped into the air, and a black wind gathered under his feet, carrying him and the handsome young man out of the city. Clouds follow the dragon, while the wind follows the tiger. Sword God Zhou, you killed my slave today. In the future, I will surely slaughter everyone around you. Just you wait. Zhuang Huisheng's furious roar resounded across the sky above Cloud Swallow City, which silenced the chaotic city in an instant. This great demon was defeated by Sword God Zhou. Since Zhuang Huisheng wreaked havoc in Cloud Swallow City, it had only been less than half an hour. There were still hundreds of thousands of people in the city who had not escaped. At this moment, when they heard Zhuang Huisheng's words, they all felt that it was unreal. You won't have the chance. Zhou Xuanji's cold voice resounded. An air-piercing sound swept across the sky above Cloud Swallow City. The Hell King's sword flew at a terrifying speed that the naked eye could not catch up with. Pish! Zhuang Huisheng's chest was pierced by the Hell King's sword, and the demonic wind around him dissipated. He opened his eyes wide and looked at the Hell King's sword that flew forward. His expression was dull. What sword technique is this? His body fell down, and he loosened his right hand instinctively. The handsome young man also fell down. Compared to Zhuang Huisheng, the handsome young man's face was full of fear. Was he going to fall to his death? At this moment, Zhou Xuanji flew over on his sword. His eyes were filled with hope. This senior sword god would surely save him. Sword god Zhou, who was benevolent and righteous, had heard of this saying before. Zhou Xuanji leaped up from the crimson dragon's sword, stepped on Zhuang Huisheng's back, and flew past the handsome young man. From the beginning to the end, Zhou Xuanji did not even look at him. He immediately lost all hope. Boom! Zhou Xuanji stepped on Zhuang Huisheng and landed on the street. The impact shattered the ground, and blood splattered all over the ground. The civilians and cultivators on the street were so frightened that they all backed away like a tide. In a split second, Zhou Xuanji beheaded Zhuang Huisheng with his sword. Blood spurted out from his neck. The handsome young man was lucky. He landed on a big tree at the side and was not severely injured. Zhuang Huisheng's right hand appeared to be of 2, and the sword pierced into Zhuang Huisheng's heart. Zhuang Huisheng's legs twitched, and he stopped moving. Zhou Xuanji stopped. After confirming that Zhuang Huixing was dead, he got up slowly. At this moment, he was still in the possession of the Nether King. The Nether King absorbed Zhuang Huixing's aura, raised his arms and roared like a ferocious demon. Looking at Zhou Xuanji, who was stepping on Zhuang Huixing's corpse, everyone on the street was dumbfounded. The great demon was dead? The Hell King's sword flew back quickly and stopped beside Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji tore a piece of cloth from Zhuang Huixing's clothes and wiped the blood off the Frost Wave sword and Hell King's sword. He looked down at Zhuang Huixing, smiled disdainfully, and turned to leave. Just then, a white light flew out from Zhuang Huixing's corpse and quickly disappeared into the sky. Zhou Xuanji did not notice this. The cultivators and commoners thought that they were seeing things. They became excited and cheered Sword God Zhou's name. Sword God Zhou. Sword God Zhou. So cool. This great demon is no match for Sword God Zhou. He definitely did not use his full strength when he fought against Northern Sword Valiant. No wonder he dares to call himself Sword God. He is the hero of our Cloud Swallow City. So domineering. Did you see the look in his eyes just now? That's the spirit I'm after. The people could not hold back their excitement. Some even cried tears of joy. With Zhuang Huixing's death, they did not have to flee Cloud Swallow City. This was their home after all. Zhou Xuanji seemed to have thought of something. He turned around and searched Zhuang Huixing's body. In the end, he found 2 storage rings and 3 storage bags. After storing them in the supreme storage, he flew back to where little Jiang Shui was on his sword. Looking at his back as he left, some elders even knelt down and kowtowed to him, as though they were worshipping a god. The handsome young man stared at him from the tree. He was in despair. "Big brother, can you save me while you're at it?" It was a pity that he could not speak and could not call out to Zhou Xuanji. Zhou Xuanji quickly returned to little Jiang Shui's side. He deactivated the Hell King's possession and fell to the ground beside her. "Are you okay?" Little Jiang Shui asked anxiously with red eyes. Zhou Xuanji felt weak in his limbs. His spirit energy was depleted, and his internal organs were in excruciating pain. He smiled bitterly, "The side effects are too severe." Little Jiang Shui quickly took out a pill and fed it to him. On the training ground, Northern Sword Valiant looked at Zhou Xuanji excitedly. Sword God Zhou really killed Zhuang Huixing and Old Qing. Unbelievable. Zhang Ryu ran toward Zhou Xuanji excitedly. Little Jiang Shui quickly took out her flaming fan and stood in front of him. Zhang Ryu stopped in front of her and waved his hand. "It's me. We met at the Shady Mountain Stronghold. I mean no harm. Sir Sword God Zhou is now a powerful cultivator that I admire the most. I have a pill that can recover spirit energy." After that, he took out 2 small white jade bottles. Little Jiang Shui looked doubtful and did not take it. Zhang Ryu immediately threw the 2 bottles to her. His face was filled with excitement, as though he was on drugs. Zhou Xuanji took the bottles and asked in his heart, "Sword Spirit, is it poisonous?" "It's not poisonous. It's indeed a pill that can recover spirit energy. The quality is not bad for you." The Sword Spirit replied, which made Zhou Xuanji heave a sigh of relief. Without a word, he opened one of the bottles and began to consume the pill. Little Jiang Shui opened her eyes wide and asked, "You trust him that much?" Zhang Ryu looked at her with a smile, as though he had just broken through to the enlightening stage. Zhou Xuanji said, "Whether it's poisonous or not, I can tell with one look." Zhang Ryu was impressed. "Sir is so powerful." Shortly after, Zhou Xuanji asked little Jiang Shui to eat it too. On the other side, Xiao Qingfeng hid in the dark and hesitated if he should go forward. At this moment, he suddenly noticed a silhouette standing on top of the Castellan's residence. "It's him." Xiao Qingfeng opened his eyes wide and quickly retreated in fear. The Castellan's residence faced the training field. On the roof, there was a proud and aloof silhouette. It was Xiao Jinghong. Xiao Jinghong looked at Zhou Xuanji, who was healing himself, and sighed in his heart. His revered teacher was really powerful. He estimated that in a few decades, he would surpass him. He glanced at the alley where Xiao Qingfeng was, and a cold glint flashed in his eyes. He immediately disappeared from the roof, as though he was never there. A while later, more and more commoners and cultivators gathered. They did not dare to disturb Zhou Xuanji, who was healing himself, but they began to help the injured nearby. Even Northern Sword Valiant was saved. After all, he still had many admirers. After Zhou Xuanji recovered part of his spirit energy, his body was still in pain. He got up slowly and prepared to leave with little Jiang Shui. At this moment, Northern Sword Valiant suddenly pushed away the people who were supporting him and smashed his forehead on the ground. He roared with all his might, "Sword God Zhou! I'm willing to be your slave for life. Please take me in. Teach me sword techniques." Swoosh! Everyone turned around and looked. Countless gazes fell on Northern Sword Valiant. I will update the list of Zhou Xuanji's attributes and legendary swords from time to time. You can also search for the author, Ren Wuxiao, on my public account. That's my other pen name. You can go and take a look. After all, I can't always mention my name in the book, or else I might make things up. Chapter 43. Willing to be my slave for life? Zhou Xuanji stopped and looked back. When he saw Northern Valiant sword kowtowing, he was a little moved. Fresh blood flowed down Northern Sword Valiant's forehead like a blood flower blooming on the ground. Little Jiang Shui pouted and said, "Wasn't he very arrogant just now?" Zhou Xuanji hesitated. Actually, it was not a bad idea to keep Northern Valiant's sword. After all, he still had plans for revenge. After thinking about it, he said to Northern Sword Valiant, 10 days later, "If I meet you at the main gate of the border, I will make you my slave." With that, he held little Jiang Shui's hand and left. Northern Sword Valiant was overjoyed when he heard that. He quickly raised his head and shouted, "Thank you, master." All the meridians in his body had been severed, so it would not be easy for him to rush to the border in 10 days. Zhou Xuanji did not reply but left quickly with little Jiang Shui. The cultivators and commoners did not chase after him, in case they offended Sword God Zhou. Today's incident had taken a turn for the better. The matter of Northern Valiant Sword becoming Sword God Zhou's sword slave would surely become a legend. Zhang Ryu looked at Northern Valiant Sword, his eyes rolling. Seeing that Northern Sword Valiant had successfully boarded Sword God Zhou's ship, he was a little moved. However, becoming a sword slave would mean losing his freedom, so he wasn't that impulsive. Sword God Zhou only needed to respect him in his heart. The other side. Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui walked quickly in the alley toward the city gate. "Are we really going to take him in?" Little Jiang Shui said unwillingly. She liked to be alone with Zhou Xuanji, and having the Northern Valiant sword around would make her feel uncomfortable. Zhou Xuanji nodded and said, "Don't worry. When the time comes, let him guard the valley for us." Northern Sword Valiant's strength and talent were not bad. Although he couldn't threaten the Empress of Great Zhou, it would be good to have someone to run errands for her in the future. Hearing this, little Jiang Shui felt that it made sense. With Northern Valiant sword strength, he would definitely be able to stand in front if they encountered danger in the future. All the way forward. After going around 2 streets, Zhou Xuanji suddenly stopped. His eyes were filled with anger as he turned around and shouted, "Who's following me?" Hearing this, little Jiang Shui turned around anxiously. A beautiful woman dressed in black walked around the corner. She was as beautiful as a flower, and her long hair was coiled up on top of her head. Her eyebrows were slightly cold, and her entire person seemed cold and elegant. "Who are you?" Zhou Xuanji asked in a low voice. With one look, he could tell that this woman was only at foundation building stage 1 and was no match for him. The lady in black gritted her teeth and knelt down in front of Zhou Xuanji. Senior, we met at the Shady Mountain stronghold. I wanted to become your slave, but you did not agree. It's you. Little Jiang Shue's eyes widened. At that time, this girl's face was dirty. She did not expect her to be so pretty. The girl in black nodded and said, "My name is Huang Lianxin. I hope Senior can accept me. I have nowhere else to go." Zhou Xuanji frowned and said, "Speak clearly. What is your motive?" Since this woman was so insistent on becoming his slave, she must have some ulterior motives. Huang Lianxin lowered her head and took a deep breath. "I want revenge." As expected. Zhou Xuanji cursed in his heart. "I have not taken my revenge yet, and you want me to help you? To be honest, I have a blood feud with the royal family." Huang Lianxin did not know what Zhou Xuanji was thinking and continued to speak. "Great Zhou imperial family?" Zhou Xuanji narrowed his eyes and asked, "Oh? Who is in the Great Zhou royal family?" Huang Lianxin gritted her teeth and said, "Zhou Yalong. Back then, when I was still young, Zhou Yalong came to my city. He went berserk in his cultivation and massacred the entire city. My father hid me in a cellar and I survived. The whole city was filled with fire and corpses. I can't forget that scene." Zhou Xuanji was stunned. Zhou Yalong went berserk? Why had he not heard of this before? But it made sense. If this matter were to be spread, it would surely affect Zhou Yalong's reputation. He reckoned that this matter had already been suppressed. There were so many cities in the Great Zhou Empire. Destroying one city would not cause too much of a commotion. "That's Zhou Yalong. You want me to die?" Zhou Xuanji pretended to be indifferent and asked. Little Jiang Shui looked at Huang Lianxin cautiously. Back then, when she was with the Yellow Gust 17 Fiends, she heard about Zhou Yalong's legend. He was someone even more powerful than the sword noble Xiao Jinghong. Most importantly, Zhou Yalong was likely to become the next emperor of Great Zhou and rule the entire Great Zhou. The emperor of Great Zhou was someone even more powerful than the Gulan demon monarch. Huang Lianxin looked up and said, "Because of your talent. I can see that you are not even 10 years old and have not regained your youth. With your talent, you can compete with Zhou Yalong." Zhou Xuanji frowned and said, "How can you be so sure that I am not even 10 years old?" Huang Lianxin said seriously, "I have talent. Ever since I could understand, I could see through the human body's meridians and bones. According to my experience, your bone age is less than 10 years old." Zhou Xuanji was stunned. Little Jiang Shui was shocked too. X-ray vision? Zhou Xuanji looked at Huang Lianxin enviously. This girl was really lucky. If she really had such talent, she was worth nurturing. He had already taken in a sword slave, so what if he took in another one? He was going to deal with the Empress in the future. Dealing with the Empress would naturally mean offending Zhou Yalong. By then, Huang Lianxin would surely be at the forefront. He muttered, "Get up and follow us." With this, Huang Lianxin looked up in surprise. Little Jiang Shui opened her eyes wide. Somehow, she thought about how Zhou Xuanji would marry more than a dozen wives and concubines when he grew up. She immediately became furious and pinched his waist. Hiss! Zhou Xuanji took a deep breath. With Huang Lianxin beside him, he did not dare to cry out in pain and could only endure it. And so, Huang Lianxin became Zhou Xuanji's servant. After leaving Cloud Swallow City, the three of them headed to other cities. Huang Lianxin took the initiative to buy a carriage for Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui to recuperate in it. She was so sensible that she immediately gained little Jiang Shui's favor. This girl did not look so annoying after all. Looking at her chatting and laughing with Huang Lianxin, Zhou Xuanji sighed in his heart. Such a silly girl. It seemed that he had to keep a close eye on her in the future, in case she did not even know that she was sold. 2 days later, they came to another city. Zhou Xuanji's injuries were healed as well. Little Jiang Shue's body was not as strong as his, so she still limped when she walked. Fortunately, Huang Lianxin was supporting her. After they entered the city, they began to buy all the things they needed, including food and materials. Zhou Xuanji had enough of barbecued meat without salt. 8 days later, the three of them came to the border. From afar, Zhou Xuanji could see Northern Sword Valiant standing at the city gate. Northern Sword Valiant saw them too and immediately became excited. Zhou Xuanji had already taken off his mask, but Northern Sword Valiant still remembered little Jiang Shui. He did not say anything but looked at Zhou Xuanji walking toward him in silence. TSK, have you heard? Sword God Zhou has entered Great Zhou's reputation ranking. Of course. He killed the old demon Qing Song and destroyed the body of the demon monarch's son. How can he not be famous? Yeah, even Senior Sword Valiant was impressed by him. After the battle at Cloud Swallow City, Sword God Zhou became famous in Great Zhou. I heard that Sword God Zhou has the body of a dwarf. Is that true? As they approached the city gate, the three of them heard the guards discussing Sword God Zhou. Chapter 44. What is Great Zhou's reputation ranking? Little Jiang Shui asked curiously. She had only heard of Great Zhou's hero ranking, because the genius on the ranking, Yi Fifan, was killed by Zhou Xuanji 7 years ago. Huang Lianxin said, it's a ranking published by the Great Zhou Empire. It records the most influential people every year. There are only 100 of them, which means that you have become this year's most influential person. Zhou Xuanji heard her and thought, I'm so famous now. He still underestimated Wang Huixing's fame. The son of the demon monarch massacred an entire city, but he was defeated by an unknown sword cultivator. It was really dramatic. At this moment, Zhou Xuanji passed by Northern Sword Valiant. Follow me, he said softly. Northern Sword Valiant held back his surprise and followed Zhou Xuanji. The soldiers guarding the pass widened their eyes, and their breathing quickened. So this kid is Sword God Zhou. Huang Lianxin left the carriage behind. It was up to fate who would accept it. Looking at the back of the four leaving, the guards were in an uproar. Sword God Zhou. So it's him. I remember him. Half a month ago, when he entered the border, I was guarding. He looks younger than my son. TSK, don't overthink. He might even be older than your grandpa. Did you see that? The Great Northern Sword Valiant is really like a slave behind Sword God Zhou. This is Sword God Zhou's spirit. The soldiers on guard duty discussed animatedly. They seemed very excited. Today's encounter was enough for them to talk about for a long time after their meals. After leaving the Southern Snow Kingdom's border custom, the four continued on their way. Northern Sword Valiant was nervous and dared not to speak much. Little Jiang Shui and Huang Lianxin were chatting happily. Oh yeah, do you like swords? Zhou Xuanji asked Huang Lianxin suddenly. It seemed casual, but it made Huang Lianxin's body tremble. She quickly replied, I like it. I also know a sword technique, but it's of a very low grade, barely yellow grade. Energy techniques, spells, and martial arts in the world all had different grades. Generally speaking, they were divided into 4 grades: heaven, earth, black, and yellow. The further grades were divided into top grade, high grade, intermediate grade, and low grade. Zhou Xuanji's white crane sword technique and fiery sword technique were only yellow grade. Only the trisource vein severing sword was at the top grade of black grade. Huang Lianxin looked at Zhou Xuanji expectantly. Could it be that Sword God Zhou was going to teach her sword techniques? Northern Sword Valiant looked at Huang Lianxin in surprise, his eyes filled with envy. At this moment, Zhou Xuanji looked back at Beixiao Wangjian and said, teach her a black grade sword technique and help her achieve great accomplishment. Northern Sword Valiant widened his eyes in shock. Huang Lianxin, on the other hand, was pleasantly surprised. Mysterious rank sword arts were not something that could be found on the continent. In the dynasty, it was a family technique that was passed down through generations. Even in the Great Zhou dynasty, it was expensive. It was definitely not something she could afford. Zhou Xuanji believed that Northern Valiant Sword must have a mysterious grade sword technique. If he did not, Zhou Xuanji would look down on him. Northern Sword Valiant took a deep breath and said, yes. Since he had already become Zhou Xuanji's sword slave, he did not dare to object. Zhou Xuanji nodded in satisfaction and said, do you know what sword technique I used to defeat you? Northern Sword Valiant shook his head, but he suddenly thought of something and muttered, Master's swordsmanship back then was quite similar to the Swordmaster's triple vein severing sword. Zhou Xuanji said, that's right. It was the triple vein severing sword. Northern Sword Valiant opened his eyes wide, and Huang Lianxin was a little surprised too. The Swordmaster's reputation was much higher than Northern Sword Valiant's. He was in the top 3 of Great Zhou's hero ranking board and had been on Great Zhou's reputation ranking for a long time. He was a powerful cultivator in the way of the sword, whose name shook the world. Although the triple vein severing sword did not belong to the Swordmaster alone, his triple vein severing sword was the most powerful and was used the most frequently. Where did you get your triple vein severing sword? Northern Sword Valiant asked curiously. The Swordmaster challenged all sword cultivators in the world. Other than the Sword Monarch of Great Zhou, he had never lost. He was one of the Swordmaster's defeated opponents. Hope was ignited in his heart. Could it be that Sword God Zhou really had the potential to defeat the Swordmaster? Pfft, little Jiang Shui could not hold back her laughter. Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin looked at her in astonishment. What was so funny? Little Jiang Shui glanced at Zhou Xuanji. After she saw him nod, she smiled and said, the Swordmaster Xiao Jinghong is his disciple. Back then, he made a bet with Xiao Jinghong. She began to talk non-stop. Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin were dumbfounded. Xiao Jinghong lost to Sword God Zhou in terms of sword techniques. Most importantly, Zhou Xuanji achieved the sword will of the triple vein severing sword within half a day. What level of attainment in the sword's way was this? At this moment, the two of them really wanted to kneel down to him. Swoosh! Zhou Xuanji whistled suddenly. With the support of his spirit energy, his whistle traveled extremely far. Northern Sword Valiant's emotions surged like waves and could not calm down for a long time. The biggest rival he saw in his life was Sword God Zhou's disciple. At this moment, he was overjoyed. Huang Lianxin was the same. With Xiao Jinghong's talent, he would catch up to Zhou Yalong sooner or later. Together with Sword God Zhou, who was even more devilish. There was hope for her blood feud. Soon, 2 dragon eagles flew over. Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin knew about Sword God Zhou's dragon eagles, so they were not surprised. Zhou Xuanji and Northern Sword Valiant rode on A Big, while little Jiang Shui and Huang Lianxin rode on Small Air. The group flew toward the valley where Zhou Xuanji and Huang Lianxin stayed. When they returned to the valley, it was already late at night. At the entrance of the valley, Zhou Xuanji asked Northern Sword Valiant to build a hut outside. Northern Sword Valiant had no objections. He turned around and prepared to cut down trees to build a hut. Huang Lianxin and little Jiang Shui were already familiar with each other. Under little Jiang Shui's request, Zhou Xuanji allowed her to enter the valley. Now, Zhou Xuanji had 2 more companions in his life. The next morning, Zhou Xuanji and the other 2 left the valley. Northern Sword Valiant was very efficient. He had already built a wooden hut that could shelter them from the wind and rain. When he heard footsteps, he woke up from his cultivation. Let's begin. Today, you will teach her sword techniques. I will watch from the side. Zhou Xuanji played with the 3-eyed drought rodent in his hand and said casually. Huang Lianxin stood behind him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were filled with excitement. Little Jiang Shui sat on a rock not far away. Behind her were a big and small heir. The two dragon eagles looked sleepy. They nodded their heads and looked like they would fall asleep anytime. Okay. Northern Sword Valiant nodded. He was a little excited too. He understood that Sword God Zhou was testing him. And so, Northern Sword Valiant taught Huang Lianxin sword techniques every day. Zhou Xuanji and little Jiang Shui internalized qi at the side and cultivated. With Zhou Xuanji by the side, Northern Sword Valiant did not dare to relax. What was worth mentioning was that Huang Lianxin's talent in the way of the sword was not bad. At least it was not too strenuous for Northern Sword Valiant to teach her. Every month, Zhou Xuanji would bring them out to exterminate bandits. Even little Jiang Shui and the two dragon eagles would participate in the battle to hone their battle skills. Zhou Xuanji's target was no longer the foundation-building bandit strongholds. He set his sights on the enlightening bandits. As they saved more and more people, their reputation grew. A year passed quickly. The name of Sword God Zhou had spread to all the kingdoms under the great Zhou Empire. The dragon eagles roared across the sky. The Sword God killed the bandits, and Sword Valiant followed. Chapter 45. The dragon eagle roars across the sky, the Sword God slays the bandits, and the Sword King follows. I don't know which talented person said it. Not bad. Zhou Xuanji, who was wearing a silver mask, nodded and smiled satisfactorily. In front of him were dozens of captive cultivators. All of them were extremely excited, and some of them were kowtowing to him. Behind him, Northern Sword Valiant was fighting with the chief of the stronghold, while little Jiang Shui and Huang Lianxin were fighting with the bandits. A big and small heir were circling in the air. Their wingspans were 15 feet long, like the combat planes of modern civilization on Earth. Their screeching reverberated on the mountaintop, like the sound of death, urging the bandits to hurry up. A year had passed. Little Jiang Shui and Huang Lianxin were no longer the same as before. They had rich battle experience. The two girls' cultivation had reached foundation building level 3. Little Jiang Shui, who was 14, had already begun to grow up. She was no longer the little girl from before. She was slim and graceful, with her hair tied up in a ponytail. Her skin was smooth and supple, and her face was even more exquisite than Huang Lianxin's. In another 2 to 3 years, she would surely be a beauty that could cause the downfall of kingdoms. Zhou Xuanji's cultivation broke through 3 levels and reached foundation building level 9. In a year, he grew a dozen centimeters taller, but he was still a head shorter than little Jiang Shui, which made him feel defeated. The captives looked at the battle and cried out in surprise. That's Sword God Zhou's sword slave, Northern Sword Valiant. He's so powerful. Sword God Zhou did not even need to attack, and he could flatten this stronghold. The two girls are powerful too, especially the little girl. The grade of that magic fan is definitely not low. Too powerful. I really want to become Sword God Zhou's subordinate. You can compare to Northern Sword Valiant? Zhou Xuanji turned around to look at the battle. Hearing the discussions behind him, he smiled under the mask. Keep bragging, don't stop. Analyze that the sword owner has reached 10 years old. Gotcha started. Ding. Congratulations, the sword owner obtained, silver, residual image sword, sword chi golden body incantation. The sword spirit's voice came suddenly, which brightened his eyes. Sword chi golden body incantation. He had already mastered the 3rd stage of the golden body art, allowing him to unleash spiritual energy from his pores to attack his enemies. His physical strength had also reached 30,000 kilograms. If the golden body incantation could be upgraded to sword chi golden body incantation, he would be even more powerful, and his cultivation would be much faster. He first pulled up the shadow sword's information. Sword name, residual image sword, level, silver, description, created from special materials. When swung quickly, it will create afterimages to confuse the enemy. Each afterimage has a certain amount of lethality. Not bad. At least the special ability didn't overlap with the other divine swords. Zhou Xuanji smiled in satisfaction. The battle was not over yet. He directly inherited the sword Qi golden body incantation. Then, a large amount of memories flooded into his mind. The sword energy golden body incantation was the upgraded version of the golden body incantation. There were a total of 5 levels: sword Qi birth, jade skin and golden bones, sword Qi soar, diamond indestructible, and flesh god sword. The first 4 levels were similar to the golden body incantation, but Zhou Xuanji had to start from scratch. After organizing his memories, he pulled up his attribute list. Sword owner, Zhou Xuanji race, Great Zhou royal bloodline age, 10 cultivation, 9th stage foundation building realm cultivation method, sword Qi golden body incantation sword art, white crane sword art, blazing flame sword art, 8-step sword steps, trisource vein severing sword, 100 miles flying sword, supernatural power, none, talent, 2 tasks at once swords, silver, crimson dragon sword, bronze, frost wave sword, silver, bloodbath sword, bronze, tiger roar sword, bronze, wind cutter sword, iron, swine culling sword, silver, golden rock sword, silver, heaven sound sword, gold, hell king sword, silver, residual image sword. It's quite magnificent. Zhou Xuanji thought proudly. He flipped his right hand, and the Hell King's sword appeared in his hand. He immediately used ranged sword propelling and tossed it out. The chief, who was fighting intensely with Northern Sword Valiant, heard an air-piercing sound coming from behind him. He turned his head instinctively, but his chest was still pierced by the Hell King's sword. Blood splattered across the sky. Northern Sword Valiant's eyes sharpened. He took the opportunity to use his most powerful sword move. His sword Qi swept across and beheaded his enemy in an instant. Zhou Xuanji raised his hand, and the Hell King's sword flew back into his hand. The captives behind him looked at him in awe. This is Sword God Zhou. He can end the battle with just one move. The captives ignored the fact that Zhou Xuanji launched a sneak attack. They only felt that he was so powerful. Every move he made was filled with an indescribable majesty. With the death of the chief, the remaining bandits fled in all directions in fear. They did not dare to fight anymore. After the battle ended, Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin began to loot the stronghold without Zhou Xuanji's orders. Little Jiang Shui ran up to him with her hands on her waist and giggled. How was it? Did I become more powerful? Zhou Xuanji nodded and said, yes, you are the most powerful. Little Jiang Shui rolled her eyes, but she was still very happy. Today, she killed a dozen bandits by herself. Before this, she had to rely on the flaming fan to kill the enemies. Looking at her excited look, Zhou Xuanji sighed in amazement. He remembered the first time little Jiang Shui killed an enemy. It was like slaughtering a pig, and she was the pig. Her reluctant look made him feel amused. While Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin cleaned up, Zhou Xuanji took out the residual image sword. The sword was black and shiny. The hilt and blade were the same color. There were no intricate carvings on it, but it emanated a powerful aura. Zhou Xuanji swung it around and realized that the sword was very light, second only to the wind cutter sword. It was quite fitting. He flipped his right hand and stored the residual image sword into the supreme storage. After a while, Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin were done cleaning up. Zhou Xuanji took out the Crimson Dragon sword and leaped up. Little Jiang Shui jumped behind him, and the two of them flew away on their swords. The 2 dragon eagles let out a long cry and chased after them. Northern Sword Valiant and Huang Lianxin took out their own swords and flew away. Huang Lianxin's sword was a level 2 enchanted artifact. Enchanted artifacts were ranked from level 1 to level 9. Each level was further divided into low, medium, high, and super grade. This sword belonged to one of the chiefs, and it was enough for her to use. Zhou Xuanji would not give away a legendary sword from the supreme legendary sword system to others, even if it was iron grade. Looking at their departure, the rescued captives sighed in amazement. A sword god was indeed a sword god. Even when he left, he was still so elegant. Next, Zhou Xuanji did not continue to challenge the strongholds but prepared to return home. After flying for half an hour, Zhou Xuanji suddenly stopped. Big and Small Air, Northern Sword Valiant, and Huang Lianxin did the same. Following their gaze, he saw a black dragon circling the ground at the end of the horizon. The black dragon was hundreds of meters long. Its black scales shone coldly under the sunlight like a mountain range. Even though it was a few thousand meters away, it was still terrifying. Such a huge evil dragon, it has at least the cultivation of rank 4, or even rank 5. Northern Sword Valiant said solemnly. Rank 4 was equivalent to Inner Pellet, while rank 5 was equivalent to Soul Fountain. Zhou Xuanji frowned. Why did he not encounter this evil dragon when he came? Prince Xuanji, it's been 8 years since we last met. You look so majestic now. An old and cold voice came from the direction of the black dragon. Zhou Xuanji heard it, and his expression changed drastically. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.